Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The dark forest of North Carolina. It was the sound of the wind in the trees that first made me uneasy. I had heard the stories about the dark forest of North Carolina, but like most, I thought they were just that, stories. Tales passed down through generations, all shrouded in mystery and myth. No one had really dared to venture too deep into the forest, but it was easy to dismiss the fears when you didn't live close by. I was an outsider, a photographer by trade, looking for a fresh story to tell, something different to capture with my camera. When I first arrived in the small town of Riverbend, I wasn't sure what to expect. It was quiet, too quiet, but in a way that felt unnatural. The locals were friendly enough, but there was always this underlying tension, like they were holding something back. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it. A rustling, far deeper in the woods than I had wandered. It wasn't the usual rustle of leaves, it was too deliberate, almost like a low shuffle, like something, or someone, was moving through the brush, too large for the ordinary forest creatures to make. But I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe. They were plentiful in these woods. But then it happened again. This time, it was closer. I had been exploring the outskirts of the forest for hours, trying to find the perfect spot for my next photograph when the sound grew louder, sharper. It sounded like footsteps. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. I looked around, trying to peer through the thick underbrush, but saw nothing. The air was thick, heavy, and damp, the kind of atmosphere where every sound felt magnified, every movement exaggerated. Probably just a hiker, I muttered to myself, trying to reassure myself. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something, waiting. I took a few more steps forward, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The wind picked up again, whipping through the trees, but the sound, the shuffle of footsteps, didn't stop. It was almost as if the forest itself was alive, moving, listening. I reached for my camera, attempting to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The forest was so dense that the sunlight barely reached the ground. The shadows played tricks on my mind, making me question every shape, every figure, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I snapped a few photos of the trees, hoping to capture something that would calm my nerves, but it didn't help. The unease settled deeper into my chest. The sound of the footsteps continued, now unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and echoing through the forest. It wasn't the sound of an animal. I took another step forward, then froze. The unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot had come from directly behind me. "Who's there?" My voice was barely a whisper, and I immediately regretted it. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the world around me silent. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, nothing except the thick, oppressive trees. No person. No animal. The breeze picked up again, but this time it felt different. The air grew colder, a biting chill that didn't belong. It was late afternoon, but the light was already dimming, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I turned back towards the trail, eager to head back to town. The sound of shuffling steps behind me remained, following me. My pulse quickened. I had been alone in the woods for hours, yet now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being stalked. Suddenly, the sound stopped. I froze, turning to glance over my shoulder once more. Silence, as if the entire forest had decided to hold its breath. Then I saw it. A flicker in the trees, a shadow. No. A figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, standing just within the shadows, watching me. It was too far to make out details, but there was something distinctly human about the shape, something that was definitely not natural. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was someone who didn't belong in the forest. I backed away, my camera still hanging at my side, forgotten for the moment. The figure didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me. I turned quickly, forcing my legs to carry me back down the path, back toward the relative safety of town. As I walked, the air grew thicker. The rustling, once distant, was now undeniably close. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence. The footsteps followed me, matching my pace. And in the eerie silence that enveloped the forest, the only thing I could hear was the whispering of the trees, like they were speaking, warning me, telling me not to venture deeper. But it was too late. I had already crossed the line. I barely slept that night. The image of that figure in the trees haunted me, its shadow creeping into my thoughts even in the safety of my motel room. The faint whispering of the wind through the trees seemed to follow me, like it was reminding me of something I had yet to understand. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was it a person lost in the woods? Or something else? The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every turn I made, every step I took, felt like it was being observed. It was as though the forest was silently keeping track of me. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I had heard the stories. People in Riverbend said that the forest played tricks on your mind, that it had a way of making you see things, hear things that weren't there. Maybe that's all it was. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to venture back into the woods. This time, I wasn't looking for photos. I was looking for answers. I had to know what was out there. What had been stalking me? The air was cooler now, a heavy fog settling in as I walked along the familiar trail. My boots crunched softly on the forest floor, and the sound was almost comforting. But it wasn't enough to ease the tightness in my chest. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I couldn't help but feel that same sensation from yesterday. Someone was there, someone was following me. I told myself it was the shadows playing tricks. The trees were dense, and the sunlight barely made it through. The mist had thickened, and the forest felt more suffocating than before. And then, I heard it again. At first, it was subtle, a slight rustling from deeper in the woods. Then, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the wind or the leaves, it was something moving. Something deliberate. The shuffle of footsteps. I stopped in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat, my pulse pounding in my ears. I scanned the trees ahead, but there was nothing. Just shadows. My mind raced. It's nothing. Just a deer or some animal. Don't be stupid. But then, I saw it again, the figure. It was standing just off the path, its outline barely visible in the fog. This time, I could see its shape more clearly, tall, too tall, and unnaturally still. The faintest movement of its limbs was enough to confirm it was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. My heart raced. I should have run. I should have turned and left the woods right then. But something rooted me to the spot, something I couldn't explain. A sickening curiosity. The need to know what was out there. The figure didn't move, but the moment I took a step toward it, it disappeared into the mist, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. For a long moment, I stood frozen, the eerie silence pressing down on me. What the hell was that? I thought. I backed away slowly, but then I heard something else. A low, guttural sound from the trees above. A rustling that wasn't the wind. It was coming from high in the canopy. I looked up, my breath catching as I saw movement in the branches. A dark shape, something large and fast, darting through the trees. The air seemed to grow colder still. A sudden chill swept through the woods, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. My mind raced. It's just an animal. Maybe a bear. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. I began to move quickly, almost running now, my feet pounding against the soft earth. I had to get out of there. The sound of footsteps followed me again, but now it wasn't just behind me. It was coming from all around me, a constant shuffling of something or someone moving through the underbrush. The trees themselves seemed to groan under the weight of whatever was in the forest with me. I was close to the edge of the woods, almost there, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scream. It wasn't human. It was a raw, animalistic cry, one that sent waves of terror through me. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing off the trunks and ringing in my ears. I broke into a full sprint, not daring to look back, not daring to slow down. My legs burned, but I pushed harder, faster, until I finally burst through the tree line and into the open field. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, gasping for breath. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, my heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of panic. The woods behind me stood still, quiet once again, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. That night, as I sat in my motel room, I couldn't escape the image of that figure. I couldn't shake the scream or the sound of footsteps that had followed me. And I knew, deep down, that I had barely scratched the surface of what was out there in those woods. Tomorrow, I was going back. I had to. There was no turning back now. The next morning came too soon. I barely slept, my dreams haunted by dark shapes and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. I knew I couldn't leave. There was something I had to discover, something that wouldn't let me go. It wasn't just a figure in the woods anymore, it was the mystery itself. The question that gnawed at me, what was really out there? The town was eerily quiet as I left my motel room. The fog from the night before had lifted, but the air still held an unnatural chill. I could feel it in my bones. I had told myself I wouldn't go back, but here I was, standing on the edge of the forest again. The trees loomed in front of me like silent sentinels, waiting. The path I had walked yesterday felt different now, wider, less familiar, as if the forest itself had shifted overnight. The birds that usually chirped in the morning were silent, and the wind had a low, mournful whine, like it was whispering something I wasn't meant to hear. I hesitated for a moment, listening to the forest. The rustling from yesterday was gone. The footsteps that had followed me were absent. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the stories had gotten to my head, and I was just another fool chasing shadows in the woods. But I knew deep down that wasn't true. I took a deep breath and moved forward, my camera in hand, trying to convince myself this was just another day in the forest, another day in the pursuit of the perfect shot. But with every step, the tension inside me grew. It felt like the trees were pressing in, closing around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The deeper I went, the darker it became. Even with the morning sun high above, the forest felt trapped in an endless twilight, the thick canopy blocking out all but the faintest slivers of light. My footfalls echoed too loudly, too sharply, against the quiet of the woods. And then it happened. A sound. A movement, just at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing but the thick trees and the oppressive silence. I stood still, trying to calm my breathing, willing myself to remain composed. It's just the wind, I thought. Just the trees moving. But that wasn't it. I felt it again, closer this time, a presence in the shadows. The hair on my neck prickled. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something watching me. I quickened my pace, moving along the path with purpose, trying to outrun the feeling. But the forest had a way of drawing you in, of keeping you trapped. The moment I thought I saw an opening in the trees, the path would twist, leading me deeper. I stopped, my mind racing. The footsteps. They were back. The same shuffling, moving behind me, echoing in the quiet woods. Only this time, there was no denying it. I turned around, my breath shallow. A figure stood at the edge of the trail, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, and cloaked in the shadows of the trees. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. My heart skipped a beat. It's here. I froze. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, caught in some invisible snare. I could hear my pulse in my ears, my mind screaming at me to turn and flee. But I couldn't look away from the figure, as if some part of me needed to understand what it was. The figure stepped forward, just a little, enough for me to see it more clearly. Its limbs were unnaturally long, too long, and twisted in a way that made me shudder. Its face, if it could even be called that, was hidden in shadow, but there were eyes. Eyes that glinted in the dark, reflecting the faintest light like the eyes of a predator watching its prey. The shuffling noise grew louder, closer, like something was moving through the underbrush toward me. The figure remained still, but I could hear it coming closer, the ground crunching underfoot, the sound of something large moving through the trees. It was closing in. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted, running down the path, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't dare stop. The footsteps behind me were getting louder, faster, keeping pace with me. My chest heaved as I ran, the trees blurring past me, but I could hear the breathing now, deep, ragged breaths that sounded too close, too inhuman. I glanced behind me, and for a brief moment, I saw it. The figure was gone. But there, in the space where it had stood, were eyes. Two glowing, red eyes staring at me from the darkness. I stumbled, tripping over my feet, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. The eyes blinked, and then a scream. A high-pitched, unearthly scream, like the cry of something in agony. It pierced the air, sending waves of terror through me. I didn't dare look back again. My only focus was the path ahead, my hands shaking as I pushed through the underbrush, the forest now alive with sounds of movement, of things closing in. Finally, I burst through the tree line, my legs giving way as I collapsed on the grass just outside the woods. I looked back at the forest, my chest heaving, but it was still. Silent. The eyes were gone. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't rationalize it. But I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't alone out there. And whatever it was that had been following me, it wasn't human. I barely slept that night. The image of those eyes, glowing red in the dark, was burned into my mind. I could still hear the echo of that scream ringing in my ears, relentless. My skin felt cold, as if the chill of the forest had followed me back, refusing to let me go. I knew I had to leave, but something inside me kept me here. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I had to uncover. The figure in the woods, the eyes, the scream, it all pointed to something bigger, something that I had to understand. The next morning, I didn't feel like eating. The town was quieter now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I packed up my things quickly, my hands trembling as I shoved them into my bag. I couldn't stay another night. But I had to go back into the woods, just once more. I had to face whatever it was that haunted this place. As I stepped out of my motel room, the air seemed heavier, the sky a dull gray. It was as if the world around me was dimming, responding to something dark beneath the surface. The path to the forest felt longer today, each step heavier than the last. The trees loomed ahead, their bare branches reaching out, almost as if they were trying to stop me from going any further. But I couldn't turn back. I reached the edge of the woods, and for a moment, I hesitated. The silence was suffocating. There were no birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just a thick, unnatural stillness that clung to the air. I felt the weight of the forest pressing on me, but I steeled myself. There was no turning back now. I stepped into the forest again, moving cautiously, every step careful, deliberate. The path seemed to twist and wind differently this time, more like a maze than a trail. I tried to keep track of where I was going, but the trees all looked the same, the fog thickening as I moved deeper into the woods. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes again, but there was nothing, just the shadows. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me, as though the trees were leaning in, whispering things I couldn't hear. My heart raced as I began to feel more disoriented, like I was being pulled into the depths of something I couldn't escape. And then, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath, I heard it again. A rustling. This time, it wasn't from far away. It was close. Too close. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was behind me, to the left, then to the right. It was moving, circling me, like something, or someone, was stalking me. I forced myself to turn around slowly, my eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Then, I heard a whisper. Soft. Faint. It didn't come from the trees. It came from inside my head. Turn back. You don't belong here. The voice was cold, almost mechanical, like it wasn't human at all. It sent a shiver down my spine, and for a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. But the voice didn't stop. It kept repeating, over and over, urging me to leave. I swallowed hard, the fear rising in my chest. It's just the forest. Just the isolation messing with me. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent. Leave now. I spun around again, trying to shake the voice from my mind, but it felt as if the trees themselves were alive, watching, listening. The mist swirled around my feet, thick and cold, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift. Suddenly, there was a sound, a snap. A branch breaking, loud and jarring. I whirled toward it, my heart pounding. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. But it wasn't like before. This one wasn't just a shadow. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs were twisted in unnatural angles, its body gaunt and skeletal. It was draped in something black, something that clung to its form like it was part of it. Its face, if it could be called that, was obscured by a hood or something even darker, just a void, an absence of features, and yet I could feel its eyes on me. I staggered backward, my breath quickening. This isn't real. It's not real. I'm seeing things. But I couldn't escape the feeling that it was. That it was real. That it was here to claim me. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow but deliberate. I could hear the soft crunch of the leaves underfoot, but it wasn't moving like a person. It was gliding, its feet never quite touching the ground. You should have listened, the voice whispered again, now louder, filling my mind completely. Now you will join us. I turned and ran. My body screamed in protest, my muscles burning as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. The forest seemed to stretch out before me, the path twisting, warping, refusing to let me escape. The whispers followed, the rustling of branches growing louder, faster. I looked back, and for just a moment, I saw it, the figure, its head tilted to the side, watching me with its empty, hollow gaze. And then, I saw something else. Behind it, in the trees, were eyes. Dozens of eyes. Glowing, watching, waiting. I stumbled, falling to the ground, the air knocked from my lungs. I scrambled to my feet, but the figure was closer now, its face still hidden, its presence suffocating. It was too much. The air around me seemed to press in, the whispers turning into screams. I could no longer tell what was real and what was a nightmare. My heart thudded in my chest, and for the first time, I understood the true danger of this place. It wasn't just the forest. It wasn't just a figure. The entire woods were alive, a twisted, sentient thing, drawing people in, trapping them in its depths. I didn't know if I would make it out, but I had to try. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. My legs burned, my breath ragged in my chest, but I didn't dare stop. The forest seemed to stretch forever, the trees closing in around me like a maze, their shadows growing darker, deeper with each passing step. The whispers were relentless, filling my head, drowning out every other thought. Leave, leave now, or you'll never leave. I stumbled again, the ground uneven beneath my feet, and I caught myself against a tree, gasping for air. The panic that gripped me was suffocating. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I had to escape. But I couldn't see the way. Every path seemed to lead me back in, deeper into the heart of the woods, and I knew that if I didn't get out soon, I would never make it. I paused, pressing my back against the trunk of a tree, my eyes darting around, frantic. My mind was spinning, my heart pounding in my ears. Was it just my imagination? Had I really seen the figure? The eyes? Or was it all a nightmare, a trick of the mind? No. I couldn't afford to doubt it. I had seen what was out there, and I had heard it, the whispers, the laughter that echoed through the trees. Something was living in these woods, something old, something that needed me to stay. It was using the forest to keep me here, to trap me in its endless night. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to calm myself, but it was no use. The silence of the forest had turned oppressive, too quiet, like the calm before a storm. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any sign of movement, but there was nothing. And then I heard it. A thud. A footstep. A slow, deliberate pace. And another. My blood ran cold. The footsteps were too heavy to be human. I whipped around, my eyes searching through the trees. My pulse raced, my hands shaking. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence, lurking just beyond my sight. It's here. A shadow moved just at the edge of my vision, a flicker of something tall and twisted. My body went cold as I instinctively took a step back, my legs unsteady. I couldn't look away. The figure was getting closer. I could hear it breathing, deep and ragged, like something that had been waiting for this moment. I turned and bolted again, my heart in my throat, my legs shaking with exhaustion. The path was a blur, the trees blurring into an indistinguishable haze of green and brown. I could hear the footsteps behind me, growing louder, faster, keeping pace as if it were toying with me. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. My body was giving up. My muscles screamed with fatigue, but I couldn't stop. Not with it so close. And then, suddenly, I stumbled forward, falling to the ground with a cry. I caught myself, hands scraping against the dirt, but I didn't get back up. Something was wrong. I couldn't move. I could feel it. Something was behind me. Something was standing over me. I didn't dare look. My chest heaved with terror, my thoughts scrambling. The whispers were louder now, frantic, distorted. Join us. Stay. Stay forever. I closed my eyes, trying to shut it all out, trying to block out the growing sense of dread. My body trembled uncontrollably as I slowly turned my head to the side, hoping, praying, that whatever was behind me would just leave me be. I opened my eyes. The figure stood there, not more than a few feet away. Its face, a void, a hollow space where features should have been, loomed in front of me. The eyes, those eyes, glowed red, unblinking, a sickening light that seemed to pierce through my soul. The hollow face tilted to the side, as if studying me. You shouldn't have come. The voice, was deep, as if it echoed from the very earth itself. My heart seized, the fear consuming me. This was it. I was trapped. There was no escaping it now. The ground beneath me began to shake, and I looked down in horror as cracks appeared in the earth. The soil split open, and I could feel the cold tendrils of something slithering up from the depths of the forest floor, crawling toward me, wrapping around my legs. I screamed, but it was drowned out by the rush of wind. The trees around me began to twist and bend, their trunks cracking, their branches reaching for the sky like fingers clawing at the air. The forest was alive. It was angry. And it was pulling me in, swallowing me whole. I tried to crawl, to push myself away from the grasping shadows, but it was no use. The more I struggled, the tighter the grip became, and I could feel the cold, the wetness, the darkness closing in. And then, I saw it. A flash of something, a person, a figure running toward me through the trees. But it wasn't a person. It was another shadow, another twisted thing that seemed to form out of the mist, like it had always been there, waiting. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the figure standing over me, watching me with those empty eyes. You're not leaving. Death on Green Street. There was something wrong with the building on Green Street. I didn't know what it was at first. It was just an old apartment complex, the kind you walk past without a second thought. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized it wasn't normal. I moved in 3 months ago, fresh off a broken relationship and looking for a new start. The apartment was cheap and the landlord seemed nice enough, though his eyes always looked tired. It wasn't until I unpacked my things and settled in that I started to notice it, small things at first. The creaks of the old floorboards. The hum of the elevator in the middle of the night when I knew no one was using it. The sounds of shuffling footsteps coming from the hallway when no one was there. At first, I chalked it up to old pipes or the building settling. But then came the whispers. It was a voice, faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. It would drift from the kitchen while I was alone in my living room or from the dark hallway just beyond my bedroom door. The first time it happened, I thought it was the neighbors. I even knocked on a few doors, but no one had heard anything. Everyone had that same blank stare when I mentioned it, as if they were used to it, used to something they couldn't explain. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But the nights grew longer, the shadows deeper. And every time I thought I was getting used to it, something new happened. It was the evening that broke me. I'd been sitting in my small living room, trying to focus on the flickering television, when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were soft, muffled, but distinct. They came from the hallway, getting closer to my door. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. My first thought was that it was the landlord, checking in on me for some reason. But when I glanced at the clock, I saw that it was well past midnight. The landlord never came this late. No one did. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was just the building's natural sounds. But then, the whispers started. Low at first, like a rustling wind through dry leaves. And then they grew louder, more distinct, until it sounded like they were speaking directly into my ear. You can't leave. I jumped up, spinning around, but the room was empty. The door was shut. Nothing was out of place. I felt my stomach turn. Was I going insane? I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog in my head, but I knew what I heard. And I knew it wasn't the wind. I went to bed that night, determined to get some sleep and push all the strange thoughts from my mind. But sleep didn't come. Not that night. The darkness of my room seemed thicker, pressing down on me. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. I rolled over to glance at the clock, 3 a.m. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft but clear, approaching my bedroom door. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was out there. But who? I got up slowly, my legs shaking, my heart racing. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, and I tried to steady my breath. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe they needed something. But when I opened the door, no one was there. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent, empty. Yet, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, an overwhelming sense of dread washing over me. I stepped into the hall, my pulse pounding in my ears. The floor creaked under my weight, the only sound in the empty corridor. I looked down toward the end of the hallway, where the stairwell led to the ground floor. It was then that I saw it, a shadow, dark and formless, moving against the far wall. It didn't seem to make sense. There was no light from the stairwell to cast such a shadow. I blinked, and it was gone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling, the sensation that something was watching me. Not from behind, but from within the shadows themselves. As if they were alive. as if they were waiting for me to make the wrong move. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me. I backed into the room, and I could hear my breath shaking in my chest. The air felt thick, pressing down on me as if the walls themselves were closing in. That's when I heard it. The whisper again. Clearer this time. You're not safe here. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here another minute. But where could I go? This was the only place I could afford, the only place that felt like home. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked again, closer this time, like someone was pacing just outside my door. I stood still, holding my breath, too afraid to move. And then it stopped. The silence was worse than anything. I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The whispers were only just beginning. The next morning, I tried to shake off the events of the night before. I couldn't explain it, but my rational mind insisted it was just stress, lack of sleep, maybe even the building settling, as I had first thought. I forced myself to go to work, telling myself I'd find a way to make peace with the apartment. Maybe I was just imagining things. It wasn't like I'd never been stressed before. And living alone in a new city? It made sense that my mind would play tricks on me. But the problem was, the strange occurrences didn't stop. They got worse. That afternoon, I returned to the apartment to find it colder than usual, a chill that crept under my skin despite the radiator running at full blast. The whispers had stopped, but a new sound took their place, a faint tapping, like fingernails lightly rapping against the walls. It wasn't constant, but I could hear it every so often when I tried to focus on anything. The noise would always stop as soon as I turned my attention to it, as if the room itself knew I was listening. I thought about calling the landlord, but I knew how ridiculous it would sound. How could I explain that my apartment was haunted by something I couldn't even describe? I would just sound paranoid. That night, I decided to do something different. I was going to stay up late, watch a movie, and just try to ignore the strange feeling that had started to haunt me. Maybe, if I pretended it wasn't happening, it would all go away. I sat in the living room, eyes glued to the screen, pretending to follow the plot of the film. But my focus kept shifting. Every creak of the floorboards, every slight shift in the air made my head snap toward the source. I felt as though I was being watched, but every time I looked up, the room was exactly the same. It wasn't until I glanced at the kitchen that I saw it. The door to the pantry was slightly ajar. I had never left it open. I always made sure to close it tightly, and yet, there it was, hanging open just a crack. My heart pounded as I slowly got up from the couch, feeling the weight of each step. I wasn't sure why I felt so scared, but the closer I got to the pantry door, the heavier the air became. The tapping sound returned, louder now, almost like a rhythmic pattern. With a trembling hand, I reached for the pantry door. As my fingers touched the handle, a wave of cold air hit my face, followed by a sudden, sharp whisper. "Don't open it." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I was about to pull away, but the need for answers, for some kind of explanation, made my hand move of its own accord. I flung the door open. The pantry was empty. Just shelves of canned goods and bags of flour, nothing out of place. But the air inside felt wrong. Thick. Pressed down, like it was holding something just beyond my vision. I slammed the door shut, nearly knocking over the table beside me. I backed away, my pulse racing in my ears. That was when I noticed the floor. There, in the corner, a fresh scuff mark. It wasn't there before. I knew it wasn't. The floor was old and scratched, but there hadn't been anything like this. I bent down to get a closer look, but the sound of scraping metal made me jerk upright. It came from the kitchen sink. The faucet was turning itself on, slowly at first, then faster, until water spilled over the edge, running across the counter. I backed away again, my legs giving way as I sank into a chair. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The rational part of me was still trying to fight it, telling me to just leave, to walk out and never come back. But the fear that held me in place was worse than the terror of the unknown. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from the other room, followed by a faint squealing sound. I scrambled to my feet, my heart thudding. I didn't want to check, but my feet moved before I could stop them. When I reached the hallway, I saw the mirror above the console table had fallen. It was shattered into jagged pieces, but that wasn't what caught my attention. There, reflected in the shards of glass, was a figure. A figure standing right behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. But the hallway was empty. No one was there. I turned back to the mirror, heart in my throat, but the figure was gone from the shards. Only broken glass remained. My thoughts raced. Was I seeing things? Was I losing my mind? A low moan echoed from the walls, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. And then, the whispers returned. But this time, they were different. They weren't just faint voices in the background. They were clear, direct, as if something, or someone, was speaking to me. We never left. You can't escape. I staggered back into the living room, shaking uncontrollably, my eyes scanning the walls, the dark corners of the room. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I tried to convince myself that I wasn't alone, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But something inside me knew it wasn't. Something in the air, in the silence of the room, told me that this was real. I was being watched. And whatever it wasn't human. The worst part was, I didn't know how long it had been here, or what it wanted from me. I couldn't sleep that night. I tried, really I did. But the sounds, the whispers, the creeping dread, it had me wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my body tense, waiting for the next thing to happen. I kept telling myself I was imagining it all, that I was just overwhelmed by stress. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just in my head. It couldn't be. The next morning, I decided to leave the apartment for a while. I couldn't stand the weight of the silence pressing down on me, the feeling of being watched from every corner of the room. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, trying to clear my mind. But as soon as I closed the door behind me, I felt a wave of relief. The sunlight felt different, warmer, safer. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt at ease. Maybe I just needed a break. I walked around the neighborhood, breathing deeply, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I even went to the local cafe to distract myself. It helped for a moment. The mundane sounds of the city, people chatting, the clink of coffee cups, grounded me. But no matter how far I went, no matter how normal the world outside felt, a nagging feeling stayed with me. A reminder that I'd left something behind. Something that was still waiting for me. As the sun began to set, I reluctantly made my way back to the apartment. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to face whatever was lurking inside. But I knew I had no choice. The door clicked shut behind me as I stepped back into the dimness of the hallway, and that familiar chill gripped me again. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, and pushed open the door to my apartment. The air was thick with tension. It felt like something was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. I locked the door behind me and turned on the lights, hoping that would somehow help dispel the unease. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew I was too late. The mirror in the hallway had been moved. I didn't touch it. I knew I hadn't. But there it was, positioned differently, as though it had been shifted on purpose. It wasn't facing the wall like it had been earlier. It was angled slightly toward the living room, its reflection catching the light in a way that sent a chill down my spine. The air felt different now, heavier, as if it had thickened since I left. I froze in the doorway, my breath shallow, eyes scanning the room for any movement. Then, I heard it. A soft rustling, like fabric brushing against fabric. It came from the kitchen, just behind the counter. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable, something moving, just out of sight. I slowly stepped forward, each footfall feeling like it echoed too loudly in the silence. My heart raced, the fear rising in my chest like a wave that refused to recede. I reached the kitchen doorway and peered inside, expecting to see something, anything, but the room was empty. Yet, I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I turned around quickly, expecting to see a person standing there, but the hallway was just as empty as before. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. A shadow, standing just beyond the edge of the hallway, near the living room. It was tall, human-shaped, but somehow distorted, blurry, like it wasn't quite real. It shifted in and out of focus, like the shadows themselves were twisting around it. I could see its shape, but its features were obscured, its face a blur of darkness. I froze, paralyzed with fear. My thoughts scrambled. I needed to move. I needed to get out. But I couldn't make my legs work. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow moved. It glided closer, the air around it growing even colder, the chill biting into my skin. The whispers returned, louder now, urgent, as if they were trying to tell me something. Get out. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I snapped back into reality, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. I bolted for the door, but as I turned to leave, the lights flickered, then went out completely. The darkness that followed was suffocating, thick and oppressive. I felt it close in around me, like it was alive, waiting to consume me. I stumbled forward, hands outstretched, searching for the door, but my fingers only met the cold wall. My heart thudded in my chest, my breath coming faster, shallow and panicked. Then, I heard it. The scraping sound, closer now. The noise was coming from behind me, dragging across the floor. It was low, almost like claws on wood, scraping and scratching, getting louder with each passing second. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except for the cold, the dark, and the whispering that now seemed to be coming from all directions. You can't escape. I bolted for the door again, this time my hand finding the handle. I turned it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it was stuck. The door was locked, but not by me. A sudden weight slammed against the door from the other side. The handle rattled violently, as if someone, was trying to break through. I yanked on the door again, but it wouldn't open. I was trapped. The scraping continued, coming closer now, and the whispers grew into something more, growls, low and guttural, like an animal closing in on its prey. I spun around, but the hallway was still empty. Yet, I felt it. Something was right behind me. Something was waiting. And it wasn't leaving until it had me. Panic surged through my body like a wildfire. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I could hardly hear the scratching anymore, the whispering that had now turned into low, guttural growls. It felt as though the air itself was closing in on me, suffocating me, pressing in from all sides. I turned back to the door. The handle rattled again, and this time it felt like the force on the other side had weight, like something tangible was trying to push its way through. I shoved my shoulder against the door, desperate to break free. The lock was stubborn, refusing to budge, but I couldn't stop, couldn't think clearly. The growls grew louder, and the darkness around me seemed to pulse with each passing second. Something was in here, and it was close. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I turned and ran down the hall, not caring where I went, just needing to put distance between myself and the thing on the other side of the door. My feet slipped across the wooden floor, the sound of my desperate footsteps filling the silent apartment. I reached the living room, the only place in the apartment that still felt somewhat familiar. The mirror on the wall still stood there, angled toward me like a silent witness. Its reflection was twisted now, as if the darkness had distorted it. I tried to gather my thoughts. There had to be a way out, some escape, some explanation. Maybe I was just losing my mind. Maybe I had imagined everything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was here. And it had been waiting for me. I couldn't face it. I couldn't fight it. I had no idea what it was or how to stop it. That's why I saw it. A flash of movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow, large and shapeless, shifting just beyond the edge of the living room. It wasn't human. It was something else, something monstrous. It didn't belong here. And it was coming closer. I froze. My legs were heavy with terror, like they were rooted to the floor. I couldn't breathe. The only sound was my heart hammering in my chest as I watched the shadow inch closer. It moved in jerky, unnatural ways, almost like it was learning how to move, stumbling toward me like it was gaining strength. I had to run. But where? Where could I go? The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in. The windows were locked. The hallway was a dead end. There was nowhere to hide. Nowhere to escape. My mind spun in circles, unable to form a single coherent thought. And then, without warning, it lunged. I didn't see it coming. 1 second, it was just a shadow, creeping along the edge of the room. The next, it was right in front of me, its shape melting into something that wasn't quite human. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch beyond their natural limits. Its face, or what I assumed was a face, was nothing but a mass of writhing darkness. 2 eyes, glowing a sickly yellow, burned into mine. The air around it smelled foul, like decay and rot, and I gagged from the stench. My body went rigid, paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. The creature's growl was deafening now, filling my ears with a low, vibrating hum that rattled my teeth. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, each one longer than the last, sharp and gleaming in the dim light. I couldn't look away. I couldn't look anywhere. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, it whispered to me, "You can't hide. You're mine now." I felt it in my bones, like an ancient truth that I had always known but had been too afraid to accept. It wasn't just here in this apartment. It wasn't just in the shadows. It had always been a part of me. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. This thing, this creature, wasn't some outside force that I could escape from. It was the darkness inside of me. It was my fear, my trauma, my guilt. It was everything I had tried to bury, and it had come to take me. I took a step back, trembling, my mind racing, desperate for a way out. But I had no more strength. No more fight left. The creature lunged again, faster this time, and I barely had time to react. Its long, gnarled hand shot out, grabbing my arm with a vice-like grip. Pain flared through my body as its fingers dug into my skin. It pulled me toward it, and I could feel its icy breath on my face, the rancid stench of death wrapping around me. It opened its mouth wide, and I knew what would happen next. It was going to swallow me whole. It was going to consume me, body and soul. I fought back, my hands clawing at its arm, but it was no use. I could feel myself slipping, like I was being dragged into a black abyss. And then, just as the darkness consumed me, there was a sudden burst of light. I gasped, the air rushing back into my lungs, and I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the blurriness from my vision. The creature was gone. I was alone. The apartment was silent again. No growls. No whispers. No shadows. I stood there for a long time, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. My heart was still racing, my skin cold with sweat. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of it all. Had it been real? Was I just losing my mind? Or had the creature actually been here, in this place, waiting for me? I didn't have an answer. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stay here anymore. I turned and stumbled toward the door, grabbing my jacket on the way out. The world outside felt distant, like a dream, but it was still real. It had to be. I never went back to that apartment. It wasn't just the memories. It wasn't just the fear. It was the feeling that the darkness had followed me out, that it was still waiting, lurking in the corners of my mind, ready to strike again. And it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I never talked about it. Not to anyone. What happened that night stayed locked in my chest, buried beneath layers of normality. But every time I walked down the streets of the city, I felt that same pull, an invisible thread tugging at my very soul, reminding me of what I had seen. I moved away, far from the apartment, as far as I could, but it never really left me. I changed jobs, changed cities, even tried to start over in a new life. But nothing could erase the feeling that I was being followed. I'd wake up at night, heart pounding, eyes searching the darkness for that shape that had once hovered on the edge of my vision. The whispers came again, too. Not the ones from the creature in the apartment, but the ones that had always been there, buried deep inside of me. The voice that told me I wasn't enough, that I would never escape. It was like the creature was inside my mind now, feeding on my fear, feeding on my doubts. It was never far away. One day, I was walking down the street when I saw a man at the bus stop. He was staring straight at me, his eyes unblinking, like he was waiting for me to notice him. I stopped, frozen in my tracks, my heart leaping into my throat. His eyes were glowing, those same sickly yellow eyes. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. There was no way. But there it was again, just like before. I stumbled backward, a cold sweat trickling down my spine. I turned and started walking quickly, then running, as fast as I could. But no matter how fast I went, I could feel its presence behind me, a shadow following in my footsteps. I found myself standing before an old, familiar building, one I thought I had left behind long ago. The apartment. The place where it all started. The door was open, the same as before. And I could hear it again, those soft, scraping sounds, the whispering that made my skin crawl. I walked toward the door without thinking. My body was on autopilot, moving toward the source of the terror that had haunted me for so long. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside. It was dark. The walls seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy, the air thick with a sense of dread. And there, in the living room, was the mirror. I could see myself in it, but I wasn't alone. The creature was there too, its form flickering in and out of the reflection, like it was waiting for me to make the final choice. I knew, in that moment, that there was no escaping it. It wasn't just in the apartment. It was in me, feeding off my fear, my guilt, my trauma. It was the darkness I had tried so hard to push away, the thing I had buried deep inside. And now, it had come to claim me. I stepped forward, my feet moving of their own accord. The mirror seemed to draw me in, like a vortex pulling me toward it. And as I got closer, I saw the thing in the reflection more clearly, its monstrous shape now fully visible. Its yellow eyes bored into mine, cold and unblinking. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice filling my mind. I reached out toward the mirror, my hand trembling. And as my fingers touched the cold surface, I felt the thing on the other side reach for me. It wasn't just a reflection. It was real. The room seemed to spin, the darkness closing in. The last thing I remember was the creature's face looming in front of me, its mouth opening wide. And then, there was nothing. Scream in the Night Train. Have you ever had that feeling? That feeling that something is not quite right, but you can't place what it is? It's like the hair on the back of your neck stands up for no reason, and the silence around you feels too heavy. That's how I felt the moment I boarded the night train to the southern states. It was just supposed to be a quick trip, a short escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. A chance to relax and clear my head. But as soon as I stepped into the train car, I knew something was off. The air inside felt stale, too still, as if the train had been waiting in the darkness for far longer than it should have. The train was nearly empty, with only a handful of passengers scattered in the dimly lit compartments. I chose a seat by the window, pulling the curtain slightly aside to see the stretch of tracks ahead, swallowed by darkness. The train's slow, rhythmic motion was soothing at first, lulling me into a sense of peace. But the more I sat there, the more I felt watched. There was an eerie quiet in the car. No chatter, no distant clinking of drinks, no shuffle of feet on the floor. Just the low hum of the train's wheels on the track, and the occasional creak of the old wood. I tried to ignore it, pulling my jacket tighter around my shoulders and settling into my seat. It wasn't long before the first strange sound reached my ears. At first, it was subtle. A soft rustling noise from the hallway outside my compartment. I told myself it was just the wind or perhaps someone walking by. But then it came again, closer this time. A dragging sound, like something scraping along the floor. I frowned and looked up, but there was no one in the hallway. Just the dull gleam of the lights above, casting long, unsettling shadows across the carpeted floor. I leaned back in my seat, trying to calm my nerves. I was overthinking it. Probably just a loose wire or some old equipment acting up. But deep down, a voice inside me told me it was more than that. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, as if whatever was making it was moving toward my compartment. I tensed, my heart beating faster, my fingers gripping the armrest. The train car was still silent, but the atmosphere seemed to change, growing heavier, colder, as if something unseen was waiting. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to look outside. As I turned my gaze back toward the window, the darkness seemed even thicker than before. The train was speeding through an endless stretch of trees and fields, and yet the night outside felt too still, too suffocating. The wind wasn't howling, no headlights from other trains or vehicles could be seen in the distance. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. A fleeting movement that vanished as quickly as it appeared. It was almost human-shaped, but not quite. I blinked and it was gone. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. But deep down, a growing sense of dread filled me. Something was wrong. Something was on this train with us, and it wasn't just the quiet. It was something else. As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. And then the whispers began. It was as if they were coming from the walls themselves. Faint, barely audible murmurs that made my skin crawl. They weren't words, just strange sounds, like something scratching against the fabric of reality. But they grew louder, more distinct with each passing minute. I glanced nervously at the other passengers. A couple sat near the back, barely moving, their eyes fixed on the empty hallway ahead. A woman further down the car was clutching her purse tightly, her gaze darting back and forth between the windows and the aisle. None of them seemed to notice. Or maybe they just weren't reacting to what I was hearing. The whispers intensified, almost becoming a constant hum in the air. I wanted to call for the conductor, ask if everything was all right. But something told me that no one would believe me. I glanced out the window again, and that's when I saw it. A pair of eyes. Glowing yellow, staring at me from the darkness outside. For a split second, I thought I saw the shadowy shape again, moving just outside my window, shifting in the night. But then it was gone. I didn't know what to make of it. My heart was racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I forced myself to focus on the sound, trying to convince myself that it was just the train's machinery making strange noises. But the whispers were still there, and I knew something was watching us. I wasn't sure how much time passed before I heard it again. The scraping noise. But this time, it was coming from right behind me. I froze. My body tense, as if my limbs no longer wanted to obey me. The scraping sound was louder, closer, like something dragging across the floor, just inches away. I turned slowly in my seat, my heart pounding. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, massive and long, stretched across the floor of the car. The shape of something enormous, creeping just behind me. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow was unmistakably rat-like. And it was moving. What the hell is that? I thought, my mind racing. That's not possible. I leaned forward, my eyes wide, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow shifted again, closer now, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the floor. I felt my breath catch in my chest. Then, the train jerked and the lights flickered. A scream echoed from the back of the train. The scream echoed through the car, sharp and panicked, cutting through the silence like a knife. My heart slammed in my chest, and I whipped my head around, desperately searching for the source of the sound. The train was still speeding forward, but the noise, raw, terrified, seemed to hang in the air like a cloud. I wasn't the only one who heard it. The few other passengers in the car jerked in their seats, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. I could hear frantic whispers from the other side of the train, the sound of feet shuffling, chairs scraping against the floor. Then, another scream. Louder this time. From further down the corridor. I swallowed hard. I needed to know what was going on, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The shadows in the car seemed to stretch and warp, the corners of the compartment becoming darker, as if something was pulling the light away. The whispers had stopped, but I still felt that presence, a suffocating weight in the air, like something was lurking just beyond my reach. The scraping sound came again. This time, I could hear it clearly. It was like nails on a chalkboard, dragging slowly across the floorboards, a relentless, gnawing noise that seemed to scrape at my very nerves. My pulse raced, and I found myself gripping the armrest so hard that my knuckles turned white. Then, the train lurched again. The lights flickered one last time and went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. I froze. Complete, utter silence followed, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. My heart hammered in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it possible? Could it be the thing I thought I saw outside the window? Was it real? I could feel my hands trembling, but I forced myself to stand up. The air was thick with tension, suffocating. I needed to move to find out what was happening. I couldn't just sit here in the dark, waiting for whatever was creeping around the corners of this train to find me. I shuffled forward, moving cautiously through the aisle. The darkness swallowed everything. I couldn't see more than a few inches in front of my face. I reached out, groping for the seat backs to guide myself. The train was completely still now, not a sound in the air except the occasional creak of the car's frame. My mind spun with possibilities. Could it be a prank? Could someone be messing with us? But then I remembered the shadow outside my window, the glowing yellow eyes. There was nothing human about that. The fear grew as I moved closer to the back of the car. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, an overwhelming sense of dread washing over me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was terribly wrong. Then I heard it. A soft rustling sound just a few feet ahead. It wasn't the scraping noise anymore. It was a softer sound, like something was dragging, or perhaps slithering. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear, every muscle in my body locked in place. No. My mind screamed. This isn't happening. I took another step forward, and then I felt it. A sudden, oppressive weight pressing down on my chest, a cold rush of air that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as if something was moving with me, something invisible but there, just out of reach, lurking in the dark. I had to move faster, had to get to the source of the noise. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness, and I could just make out the shapes of the other passengers, huddled in their seats, frozen in terror. The woman in the back was still clutching her purse, but now her hands were trembling so violently that her whole body was shaking. The rustling grew louder. I quickened my pace, but someone grabbed my sleeve. I jerked back, my heart leaping into my throat. My eyes widened as I turned to face whoever had touched me. But there was no one there. I glanced around, but I was alone in the aisle now. Everyone else was motionless, still in their seats. My breathing was ragged, panic rising in my chest. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of claws tapping against the floorboards. And then, a whisper, as if it were coming from right next to my ear. Get out. The voice was faint, raspy, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I shivered, the hair on the back of my neck standing straight up. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could hear the creatures now, moving through the darkness, their claws scraping against the metal floors, the sound echoing in my ears like the approach of something massive. And then, in the distance, I saw something move. A shadow, larger than life, stretching across the floor, creeping toward me like an unholy beast from the depths of the earth. It was too big to be human, too monstrous to be a figment of my imagination. It was real. And it was getting closer. What the hell is happening? I thought, panic flooding my mind. I need to get off this train. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness had swallowed the train whole, and now I was trapped in it. A screech split the air. A bone-chilling, high-pitched cry that sent a jolt of pure terror down my spine. It was the sound of something in pain, or something far worse. The shadow shifted again, and then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the dim light from the emergency lantern above. They were wide, unblinking, and staring straight at me. I froze. The creature was here. And it wasn't going to let me go. The eyes were locked onto me, two glowing yellow orbs in the suffocating darkness, gleaming with an unnatural hunger. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, each beat shaking me to the core. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, as though it was pressing in from all sides, crushing me. The creature shifted again, its massive form sliding out of the shadows, moving with eerie silence as if it were part of the darkness itself. I could hear its breathing now, ragged and heavy, like the wind in a storm, but deep, guttural, like something far from human. The sound of its claws scraping the floor grew louder, closer, the rhythm of its approach steady, relentless. I didn't know what to do. I had no weapons, no escape. I was trapped in a moving metal cage, and it was closing in on me. I need to think, I told myself, forcing my trembling legs to move, even if only an inch. There has to be a way out. I scanned the aisle, the dark corners of the train now full of shapes that twisted and blurred in my mind. My hands were clammy with sweat as I reached for the nearest seat, grabbing onto the fabric for support. My thoughts raced. Was this the creature I saw outside the window? Was it real, or had my mind been playing tricks on me all along? I couldn't answer. The only thing I knew for sure was that it was here now, and it wasn't alone. There was another rustling sound, coming from behind me. My breath hitched, and I dared not turn. Something was moving in the rear of the car. Something far too large to be a passenger. I could hear it now, padding softly along the floor, its claws clicking against the metal. The creatures were everywhere. There was no escape. I turned back to face the eyes, which were still fixed on me, unblinking. I had to do something. Move. Move now. My mind screamed, but my body was frozen in fear. The creature took another step forward, its massive bulk shifting in the shadows. It wasn't fast, but its presence was overwhelming, like the weight of the earth itself was pressing down on me. I could feel the temperature dropping, the air thickening. It wasn't just a physical presence, it was something more. Something ancient. In the stillness, I could hear the faintest scraping sound again, closer now. My pulse raced. Something was moving behind me, closing in. I had to act. I couldn't let it get any closer. With every ounce of willpower I could summon, I forced my legs to move. I darted forward, stumbling over the uneven floor, my mind focused only on getting away from those glowing eyes, from the thing that was watching me. Suddenly, I heard a low growl, and then the unmistakable sound of claws digging into the floor as it began to chase me. The scrape of its feet was followed by a deep, rumbling growl, and I knew I had to keep running. I turned a corner, pushing past the seats, not daring to look behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning, my legs aching. But I didn't dare stop. I ran for what felt like hours, the sound of my own footsteps mingling with the terrible scraping noises that echoed from the darkness. But I couldn't outrun it. I could feel it getting closer. The creature's breath was growing louder, heavier, and I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that it wasn't chasing me anymore. It was hunting me. I rounded another corner and found myself at the end of the car with no way out. The door at the far end of the train was locked. I grabbed the handle, desperately pulling, but it wouldn't budge. Panic flooded my veins as I realized there was nowhere to go. I turned around to face the creature, and my heart nearly stopped. There it was. It had emerged from the shadows completely, its massive body filling the aisle. It was far larger than any animal I'd ever seen, its fur matted and slick, its form stretched unnaturally long. The yellow eyes glowed like lanterns in the blackness, and its jagged, exposed teeth glinted with a sickening sheen. The beast's claws scraped against the metal floor as it moved toward me, each step causing the train to shudder. I backed up against the door, my body shaking with terror. There was no way to fight it. No way to escape. Please, no, I thought, my mind spinning with hopelessness. And then I saw something I hadn't noticed before. At the back of the car, near the emergency exit, a small, faint light flickered. My mind raced. Maybe I could get to it. Maybe there was another way out. But the creature was almost upon me now. I could hear its breathing grow louder, more ragged, and its glowing eyes were filled with something dark, something far too intelligent for a mere animal. I knew I had to make a choice. I had to do something, anything. No, I will not die here. Not like this. With one last surge of adrenaline, I bolted for the flickering light. I could feel the cold breath of the creature on my neck, could hear its claws scraping the metal with a horrifying intensity, but I refused to stop. I couldn't. I reached the emergency exit, my fingers scrambling for the latch. My hands were slick with sweat, but I pulled it open. A wave of stale, cold air hit me, and I stumbled out into the darkness of the tunnel. For a moment, I thought I had made it. I was free. But then I heard the creature's roar, a deafening, primal sound that echoed through the darkness, a cry of rage and hunger. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the ground beneath me. But there was no escape. No safety. And I heard the scrape of claws behind me, growing louder with each step. Whatever was chasing me, it would never stop. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, my heart hammering in my chest, my breaths ragged and desperate. The tunnel stretched endlessly before me, an infinite black void that seemed to swallow every sound, every hope. The only thing I could hear now was the rhythmic scraping of the creature's claws against the concrete, echoing through the narrow passage. It was so close. Too close. I glanced over my shoulder, unable to resist the urge to look. The creature was just a few yards behind me, its glowing eyes locked onto me with a chilling, unblinking focus. It was gaining on me, moving swiftly despite its massive size, its claws clicking against the floor like the ticking of a clock counting down to my end. It was relentless. I couldn't outrun it. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but I was running out of energy. My legs were shaking, my vision was blurry, and every breath felt like it could be my last. I had to make a decision, fight or flee. What am I supposed to do? I reached a bend in the tunnel, my mind frantically searching for any kind of exit, any way to break free from the creature's pursuit. But there was nothing. The tunnel continued, winding deeper into the earth, leading me further into the heart of darkness. And then, I saw it. A faint light ahead, shimmering in the distance. It was weak, flickering like a candle about to be snuffed out, but it was there. The possibility of escape. I had to reach it. If there was a way out, it had to be there. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my muscles screaming for relief. But the creature was gaining on me. Its growls were getting louder, more guttural, and the sound of its claws scraping the floor grew closer with every passing second. I could hear its breathing now, ragged and heavy, as if it were savoring the hunt. I was its prey. I reached the light. It was coming from a small grate in the wall. I threw myself at it, desperate to escape. The bars were old, rusted, but the grate gave a little under my weight. With trembling hands, I gripped it and pulled, my body screaming in protest. The creature's growl grew louder. It was right behind me. This is it. The grate came loose, and I pushed through the small opening, scraping my skin on the sharp edges. The tunnel beyond the grate was even darker, but there was no time to hesitate. I crawled through, my chest tight with fear, my body aching. As I pulled myself through the narrow space, I could feel the creature's presence behind me, almost tangible. I reached the other side, panting, covered in sweat and dirt, but I wasn't safe yet. I wasn't safe at all. The creature's growls were no longer behind me. They were ahead of me. It had circled around, anticipating my every move. And now, it was waiting. I stood up, my back pressed against the cold, damp wall. There was nowhere to go. No way out. No escape. I could hear the creature's claws scraping against the concrete floor again. The sound was deafening, like thunder rolling through the ground. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, but now they were not just yellow, they were red. A deep, blood-red glow that seemed to burn with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It's not just an animal, I thought. This is something far worse. Something wrong. The creature stepped forward, its hulking body emerging from the shadows. It was massive, its fur matted with dirt and blood. The sharp, jagged teeth glinted in the dim light, and its claws clicked against the floor like the ticking of a clock. But there was something more in its eyes. Something that wasn't just hunger. It was intelligence. Malice. It was playing with me. I raised my hands, trying to back away, my mind racing. What do I do? What do I do? I couldn't think. I couldn't focus. The creature was moving closer now, its breath hot and foul in the air. I stumbled back, my hands pressed against the wall, my legs shaking. I needed to make it stop. And then I remembered something, a small tool I had found earlier, buried beneath the rubble. A crowbar. It wasn't much, but it was something. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out, my fingers trembling as I gripped it. This is my only chance. I swung it at the creature, desperate to make contact, to push it away. The crowbar struck its shoulder with a sickening crack, and the creature let out a shrill screech of pain. For a moment, I thought I had heard it. But then, it lunged. Time seemed to freeze as the creature's massive jaws snapped shut in front of me, just inches from my face. I didn't have time to react. It was too fast, too strong. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through my clothes, ripping through flesh. I screamed in agony, falling to the ground, my blood staining the floor. But I wasn't dead. Not yet. I raised the crowbar again, my last hope. I swung it at the creature, aiming for its eyes. And then, with all the strength I had left, I drove it into the creature's skull. The world went silent. For a moment, everything was still. The creature's body twitched and shuddered, and then, with a final, horrific screech, it collapsed. Its massive form hit the ground with a sickening thud, and the faint light above flickered once more before going out. I was alone. The tunnel was silent. The creature was dead. But I wasn't free. Not really. The darkness closed in around me, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. My body was broken, my mind fractured. And somewhere deep in the darkness, I could still hear it. The faint scraping of claws against the walls, echoing through the tunnel. It's not over. The air felt heavier now. As I lay on the cold, damp floor, blood pooling around me, I knew this was far from over. The creature had fallen, but something else was wrong, something I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't just the physical pain that consumed me, nor the deafening silence that followed the creature's death. It was a deeper, more unsettling feeling. A feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The claw marks on my chest burned with a terrible fire, but my eyes couldn't leave the lifeless form of the creature sprawled on the floor. The red glow had faded from its eyes, but there was something disturbingly familiar about it now. Its body, twisted and contorted, no longer looked like the monstrosity I had been fleeing from. It looked human. I blinked, trying to clear the blurring images in my mind. Maybe it was the blood loss, maybe the exhaustion, but my mind felt foggy, distorted. I tried to push myself to my feet, my legs shaking with the effort. The crowbar was still gripped in my hand, its cold steel a faint comfort. No. It's not over yet. I thought, my heart hammering as realization crept in like ice crawling up my spine. I looked around. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but now something else had shifted. The dim lights flickered above, their weak glow barely cutting through the darkness. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, as if the walls themselves were alive. And then I heard it, a faint sound, so quiet at first that I thought I imagined it. A whisper, like the scrape of nails on stone. But it wasn't the creature. It was too human. Too deliberate. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. Behind me, where the creature had fallen, the shadows seemed to shift. There, emerging from the darkness, was another figure. It was smaller than the creature, but its presence was no less terrifying. The figure stepped into the faint light, and my heart skipped a beat. It was a man. Or, at least, it looked like one. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes wide and empty, a deep, unsettling black. His clothes were ragged, torn as though he had been living in these tunnels for years. And his smile, that smile, twisted, knowing, made my stomach churn. You were waiting for me, I managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before me. The man's lips curled into a twisted grin. Waiting? No. I was watching. Always watching. Watching? I struggled to stay standing, but my legs buckled beneath me. My hands, slick with blood, could barely grip the crowbar anymore. The pain in my chest was unbearable, but what was more terrifying was the revelation that hit me like a tidal wave. I wasn't just fighting a creature. I wasn't just fighting some primal beast in the tunnels. I had been part of something far darker, far more twisted than I could ever imagine. The man stepped closer, and I saw something in his eyes, something that froze my blood. Recognition. I had seen this man before. Not in the flesh, but in my dreams. In the strange flashes of memory that haunted me every night, the disjointed, fragmented images that made no sense. The man I had seen at the work site, the one who had gone missing. And the creature, it wasn't a creature at all. It was him. He had somehow turned into this monster. But he wasn't just some accident of nature. No. This had been intentional. He took another step forward, his voice now a low, rasping whisper. I told them it would work. I told them, but they didn't listen. They never listen. My mind reeled, trying to piece together the fragments of the truth. The workers had disappeared one by one. I had seen their faces, but I hadn't connected the dots. This man was no random worker lost to the depths. He was something else entirely, part of some twisted experiment. I had to stop him. I had to end this before it consumed me entirely. But as I lifted the crowbar one last time, ready to strike, the ground beneath me trembled. The walls around me groaned as if they were shifting, changing. The man's eyes widened in a sick, knowing gleam. You can't stop it, he hissed, the grin never leaving his face. It's already begun. Suddenly, the sound of scraping claws filled the tunnel again. It wasn't just one set of claws now. It was many. I froze, unable to comprehend the scale of the nightmare unfolding. Shadows twisted, converging, and from the depths of the tunnel, more creatures emerged, more human shapes that had been twisted into monstrous forms, each more grotesque than the last. The man's laughter echoed through the tunnel. This place was never just for digging. It was for breeding. The words hit me like a physical blow. Breeding. I looked around, my mind struggling to understand the horror of what he was saying. These creatures, they weren't natural. They were the result of something dark and horrible, something engineered to breed and grow in the very heart of the city. I could hear them now, their growls reverberating through the walls, closer and closer. My pulse quickened. There was no way out. The man's form began to dissolve into shadow, his figure becoming a part of the darkness itself, melting away as the creatures surrounded me. I raised the crowbar in desperation, but I knew it was too late. The last thing I saw before everything went black were the eyes, countless glowing eyes, watching, waiting. My body froze, the realization sinking in. I had never been alone in these tunnels. They had been here all along. And now, they were coming for me. Banshees of the West. It started with a question I couldn't shake from my mind as we drove deeper into the desert. What do you think we'll find there? We had been talking about it for days, this old, abandoned town in the middle of nowhere. Somewhere in the heart of the West, where the sun was a constant blistering presence and the only sound for miles was the wind. We were on a road trip, four of us, me, Jason, Laura, and Derek. We had planned this trip as a way to blow off steam after finals. But there was something about this town that made me uneasy from the start. It wasn't just its desolation, it was the rumors. They were subtle, whispered stories from people who had passed through. The kind of rumors that stick with you, even if you don't want them to. The stories spoke of strange, unexplained sounds in the dead of night, of shadows seen flickering in the windows of the decaying buildings, of lights that shouldn't have been there. And worst of all, they spoke of cries, high-pitched, mournful wails that would echo across the desert under the cover of darkness. As we made our way down the lonely stretch of highway that led to this forgotten place, I felt it, this strange sense of foreboding. Something about the emptiness out here, the way the landscape stretched endlessly under the heat of the midday sun, made the air feel heavy, thick with anticipation. The others seemed oblivious to the tension in the air, their voices light and carefree, but I couldn't stop thinking about the town ahead. The closer we got, the more a tight knot of dread formed in my stomach. "Hey, do you hear that?" Derek's voice broke through my thoughts. We were still miles away from the town, the road a thin line slicing through the vast nothingness, but I heard it too. A sound, faint but distinct, carried on the wind. It was a wailing noise. Almost human. "What the hell is that?" Laura asked, her voice tight. Jason slowed the car, his brow furrowed. "It's probably just a coyote. Or the wind playing tricks." But I wasn't so sure. The sound was too clear, too distinct. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be easily dismissed. It felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your hair stand on end. A sound like a woman crying, carried across miles of empty land, reaching out to you, begging for attention. I looked out the window, scanning the horizon. There was nothing, just the dry earth and the occasional shrub dotting the landscape. But the noise kept coming, echoing in my ears, growing louder. Or was it just my mind? "There it is again," I whispered, more to myself than to the others. Jason pulled the car off the main road, a gravel trail leading toward the town. "Let's check it out. It'll be an adventure." The words didn't comfort me. If anything, they made the feeling of unease in my gut grow stronger. But I stayed quiet, following Jason's lead as we parked the car at the edge of the ghost town. The heat hit us the moment we stepped out of the car, a thick, suffocating air that clung to our skin. The town lay before us, just a cluster of crumbling buildings, the skeletal remains of a place that time had forgotten. There were no people, no signs of life, just the wind sweeping through the empty streets, carrying with it the faintest echo of that wailing sound. I didn't want to go further, but I followed the others, who were already making their way down the main street. My eyes scanned the town, my breath quickening as I took in the details, the broken windows, the splintered doors, the faded remnants of life that once thrived here. This place didn't just feel abandoned. It felt wrong. The kind of wrong that settles deep in your bones. "Hey, check this out," Derek called from a nearby alley. He was crouching in front of something half buried in the dust. I walked over, my curiosity piqued despite the growing unease gnawing at me. It was a piece of torn fabric, blood-stained and frayed, caught on a rusty metal signpost. My stomach churned at the sight. It was too much, too soon. But the others didn't seem to notice the same way I did. "It's just trash," Jason said, brushing past us. But something about the fabric didn't sit right. It wasn't just discarded, it was torn and stained, as if it had been left behind in a hurry. It was too deliberate. I stood there for a moment longer, staring at it, trying to shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Then I heard it again. That wailing. Louder now. Closer. "Guys, "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice strained. But it was too late. The shadows around us seemed to grow longer, stretching out like tendrils. The buildings loomed like silent sentinels, and I could feel someone, watching us from within the dark windows. The wail grew louder still, and now it wasn't just a cry. It was a scream. The others stopped, their faces drawn with confusion and concern. "What is that?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer. I only knew that whatever it wasn't something we should be facing. The air around us thickened, as if the very atmosphere was alive, pressing in on us. "Let's head back to the car," I suggested, my voice tight with fear. "Now." But as we turned to go, I felt movement in the corner of my eye. Something dark, shifting in the window of the building across the street. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was someone, or something, watching us from the darkened room. Its eyes gleamed with a faint, unnatural light. It was too far to make out any details, but I didn't need to see more. I felt its gaze like a weight on my chest, suffocating. The wail came again, louder now, impossibly close. It was no longer a distant cry, it was right behind us. I turned, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, carrying the echoes of something much darker than the desert night. Something was waiting for us. And it wasn't going to let us leave. We didn't talk as we walked back to the car. The silence between us was thick with a kind of mutual understanding, though none of us said it aloud, we all felt it. The air was heavier now, as though the very world around us was holding its breath. Every step we took felt like it was being measured by unseen eyes, and the distant wail echoed in our minds, stretching out the seconds into an eternity. As we reached the car, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The street was empty, too empty. No movement. No sounds except the howling wind. The buildings seemed to close in, the shadows darker than they should have been. I tried to shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. Jason was already at the car, fumbling with the keys. His hands shook. I could see it now. He was afraid too, though he hadn't admitted it yet. Derek and Laura climbed into the back seat, their faces pale, eyes wide. "Let's just go," Laura said, her voice barely a whisper. She was the one who usually kept things light, but now there was no levity in her tone. Jason nodded quickly, his foot pressing harder on the accelerator as he pulled away from the town. But the moment we started moving, I noticed something, the wailing. It was still there. It didn't fade, didn't disappear as it should have. It followed us. I could hear it in the back of the car, a faint, sorrowful cry that seemed to come from nowhere. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice almost trembling. "Yeah," Jason said, his voice tight. "It's just the wind or something." But I wasn't convinced. There was no wind here. The air was still, suffocatingly still. And that wail, it wasn't natural. It was too distinct, too human. The sound of a woman in pain. I stared out the window, trying to focus on anything other than the noise. The dry, cracked earth stretched out on either side of the road, a barren wasteland. But as we drove on, the road seemed to get narrower, more twisted. The landscape started to change, and I couldn't place it. I looked at the others, but no one seemed to notice, no one but me. "Are we going the right way?" Derek asked from the back seat, his voice breaking the tense silence. Jason started, but his words trailed off. He had to be questioning it too. The map had shown a straight path, but now the road seemed different. The landmarks, the familiar markers, had disappeared. All we could see were dark, twisted shapes rising from the horizon, shapes that didn't belong, dark against the lightning sky. And still, the wailing continued, growing louder with each passing second. What the hell is happening? Derek's voice was more frantic now. He leaned forward between the seats, his face just inches from mine. Shut up, Derek. Jason snapped, his eyes wild. Just let me think. But I couldn't stop looking out the window. The landscape was changing too quickly, too much. We were no longer in the open desert. I couldn't recognize the scenery anymore, and something in my gut told me that we weren't on the same road anymore either. The road had twisted in ways that didn't make sense. We should have been miles away from that town by now, but it felt as though we were still there, trapped in some loop. Look! Laura shouted from the back seat. Her voice was panicked. I turned to look at her, and the fear in her eyes made my stomach drop. In the distance, the silhouette of the ghost town was visible once again, rising out of the desert like a specter. That's impossible, I muttered. We've been driving for... The clock on the dashboard was wrong. It showed a different time, one that didn't make sense. It had been an hour, maybe more, since we left. But the town was still there, still standing in the distance, impossibly close. We were caught in a loop. I grabbed my phone and checked the GPS. It was glitching, flickering between the same 2 points, showing us in the middle of the desert, then back near the town, then again. The map was going haywire. Are we stuck here? Laura asked, her voice small, trembling. Jason slammed his fist against the steering wheel. We've got to get out of here. We've got to get away from that place. But how? How do you escape something like this? The wailing came again, closer this time, and for a split second, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, standing at the side of the road. It was just a shadow, a silhouette of a person, but it wasn't real, not in any way that I could explain. Look out! Derek shouted. He was pointing wildly at the road ahead. I snapped my attention back to the windshield, and my breath caught in my throat. Something was in the road. A woman, no, not a woman, her form was wrong. Her body was distorted, stretched unnaturally thin, her long hair whipping around her face like it was alive. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth hung open in a scream, though no sound came from her. Jason swerved the car, jerking the wheel to avoid her. But there was no escaping her. She was everywhere. The air thickened. The space around us warped, and I could feel the car shaking. No! Jason screamed. We were spiraling, out of control. The woman, the banshee, was everywhere. Her wail filled the car, the air, the world. And just before we crashed, I heard her voice in my ear, a whisper that chilled me to the bone. You can't leave. The world crashed in an explosion of sound and motion. My head slammed against the side window, my body thrown violently forward as the car skidded off the road. It felt like we were trapped in some nightmare, where time and space no longer mattered, where reality itself had bent to something darker. For a moment, there was silence. No wind. No wail. Just the thudding of my heart, a dull ringing in my ears, and the faint groan of metal twisting around us. I opened my eyes, disoriented, blood warm against my cheek from the impact. My hands were pressed against the seat, struggling to keep me upright. Slowly, I managed to shift in my seat, the reality of our situation flooding my senses. The car had come to a stop, partially crushed against a dry, cracked hill of dirt. But where were we? I tried to make sense of the surrounding area, but it only added to the confusion. The road we had been on was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of lifeless ground. The town was no longer visible, but something else lingered, a presence, a feeling of being watched, just beyond my line of sight. I pushed myself out of the car. My body ached with the impact, but I had to get out. I couldn't stay in there, couldn't stay trapped in that metal cage. My legs wobbled as I stumbled out into the desert. Jason was already out of the car, too, his face pale and sweat-soaked. Derek and Laura followed, their eyes wide with panic. What the hell just happened? Jason breathed out, his voice thin and shaky. This can't be real. We need to get out of here, Laura whispered, her voice high-pitched, trembling. Her hands were shaking, clutching her backpack as though it could offer her some protection. We need to go back, find the town, and... No, I interrupted, my voice hoarse. We can't go back. We've got to move forward. We're stuck in something. A loop. A trap. Derek looked at me with wide eyes, his breath rapid. What do you mean a loop? I mean, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I was right, wasn't I? This place felt wrong, unnatural. We've been here before. Or something like it. I glanced around, and the land stretched out before us. The cracked earth, the same lifeless hills, the same eerie silence. There was no sign of the road, no sign of the car, and nothing to indicate which direction we should go. Maybe we can get a signal, Jason said, fumbling with his phone. His voice was tinged with desperation. I'll call for help. I'll call the cops. I watched him as he stared at his phone, his fingers swiping across the screen. No signal. No connection to the outside world. We're not going to get help, I said, my throat tight. Something's wrong with this place. It's like it's pulling us in. Jason shot me a look, his face a mixture of frustration and fear. Stop. Don't say that. We're fine. We just need to figure out where we are, okay? We can get out of here. But his words didn't seem to convince anyone. We all knew something was wrong. The air itself felt thick, heavier, like we weren't supposed to be here. A whispering wind moved across the land, but there was no breeze, no source to explain it. And then I heard it again. That wail. Faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of a woman in pain. Her voice. It was coming from somewhere ahead of us. So faint, so distant, that it almost felt like an illusion. But it wasn't. It wasn't an illusion. I could hear it clearly. It was real. Do you hear that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The others froze. Their eyes locked on me, fear in their faces. You hear that too? Laura's voice cracked. It's that same sound, Derek said, his voice thick with disbelief. That crying, that wailing. It's coming from over there. I looked toward the horizon, where the sound seemed to be originating. The land stretched out before us, empty and barren, but there was something out there. A silhouette, just beyond the next hill, something dark and twisted standing in the distance. I'm not going any closer, Laura said, her voice full of panic. We're getting out of here. Now. I opened my mouth to argue, but then the air around us seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and the wind picked up again, swirling around us in a frenzy, carrying with it a faint, mournful cry. I turned back to the others. We're not going to outrun this. Whatever this is, it's already here. We need to figure out what it wants. Derek, usually the most rational among us, looked at me in disbelief. What are you talking about? What the hell does it want? I swallowed hard. The truth seemed absurd, even to me, but the terror in the air was too real to ignore. I think it wants us. It's hunting us. For a moment, no one said anything. We just stood there, staring out at the bleak, empty landscape. The crying was louder now, unmistakable. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, silhouetted against the dimming sky. A woman. A woman with long, flowing hair and a tattered dress. Her face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel her eyes on us. The wailing grew louder, piercing the air, and for a moment I thought I saw her move. But then, just as suddenly, she vanished. Disappeared into thin air. Where did she go? Laura gasped. She stepped back, trembling. She's gone, Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. But I knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Get back to the car, I said, my voice frantic. Now! We all ran back toward the car, the wailing following us, echoing in the air. But as we reached it, something stopped us. The car wasn't where we'd left it. Instead, it was on the other side of the hill. Far away from us. We hadn't moved it. We hadn't touched it. But somehow, it had moved itself. My heart pounded against my chest as I stared at the car, now sitting ominously on the other side of the hill, untouched but miles away from where we had left it. It was like we had stepped into some twisted version of reality where nothing made sense. I could feel my hands tremble as I tried to make sense of the impossible. We didn't move it, Jason said, his voice barely audible. He was staring at the car, eyes wide with disbelief. Then how the hell did it get over there? Derek asked, his tone sharp, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I took a step toward the car, my legs feeling like they were moving through thick mud. Every instinct in my body told me to run, but something deeper kept me rooted to the spot. It was like a magnetic force was pulling me closer, urging me to confront whatever had happened. There's only one way to find out, I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Laura's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. You're not seriously suggesting we go over there, are you? I didn't respond. There was no time for arguing. We couldn't outrun whatever was out here, and our best chance was to understand what was happening. If we could figure out the rules of this place, maybe we could break free. We began walking toward the car, each step heavy, the weight of dread pressing down on us. As we got closer, I felt a shift in the air. It was thick with something I couldn't describe, an oppressive heaviness that seemed to make the very earth beneath our feet feel unstable. Every step we took seemed to echo too loudly, and the silence between those echoes was suffocating. The car stood there like a sentinel, its windows dark, its doors slightly ajar, as though inviting us inside. But I knew better than to trust that. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. There was something wrong with the way the car looked, with the way it had moved when we weren't looking. Stay close, I ordered, but my voice came out as more of a whisper than a command. As we approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just beyond the corner of my vision. The wail from before had faded, but there was an unsettling quiet now, one that made the air feel like it was holding its breath. We reached the car. The doors creaked open as though the vehicle itself had been waiting for us. I glanced inside, my eyes darting over every inch of the interior. There was no sign of anyone. No one had been inside the car, and yet I could still feel the weight of a presence. The seats, the dashboard, the steering wheel, all untouched. But the air inside felt wrong, like it was infused with something dark. "Something's not right," Derek said, his voice tight with tension. He was standing just behind me, eyes flickering nervously. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A soft, low scrape from beneath the car. It was subtle at first, but then it grew louder, more insistent. It was as though something was moving under the vehicle, something big, something that didn't belong. I backed away, my pulse racing. "Get back. Now." We stepped back quickly, our eyes scanning the area. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving us in the deafening stillness once again. But then, something shifted. A dark shadow, too large and too fast to be a human figure, darted from behind the car. My breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a woman in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by shadow. Her hair whipped around her face in a frenzied dance, as though blown by an unseen wind. And then, just as quickly, she was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the desert. My blood ran cold. I spun around, my eyes darting back to the others. "We need to leave. Now." But before any of us could move, the ground beneath us trembled. A low rumble, like thunder, but deeper, more visceral. It was coming from somewhere beneath the earth, and it was getting louder. The wailing started again, this time closer, more urgent. The ground trembled again, harder this time. A crack appeared in the earth just a few feet away from us. The car rattled, and I could hear the scraping sound beneath it once more, growing louder, closer. "We have to go." Laura screamed, her voice shrill with panic. Without thinking, I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward me. "Run." We turned, sprinting away from the car and toward the barren hills, our footsteps thundering in the oppressive silence. I could hear the others behind me, their breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare look back. Whatever was beneath the earth, whatever had moved the car, was following us. The wailing intensified. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens, hundreds, echoing from the earth itself. The sounds of women crying, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, desperate chorus. It was like the land itself was alive, and it was hungry. We reached the base of a hill, but the ground continued to shake, and the cracks in the earth were widening, revealing something in the dark, something huge. I glanced up at the hill ahead of us. There was a small outcrop, a cave-like opening carved into the rock. It was our only chance. "Over there," I shouted, pointing toward the cave. "Move." We stumbled toward the outcrop, pushing ourselves forward, our legs burning from the effort. The wailing was deafening now, so loud it felt like it was vibrating through my skull. I could feel the weight of the voices pressing down on me, the anguish and fury of women long dead. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We reached the cave, and I shoved everyone inside, stumbling in after them. As I turned to block the entrance, the last thing I saw was a figure, tall, shadowed, and female, standing at the edge of the darkness. Her eyes gleamed with a terrible, unnatural light. And then, the world went black. I don't know how long we had been in that cave. Minutes? Hours? The wailing from outside had not stopped, and the ground beneath us continued to tremble as though the very world was being torn apart. Inside, it was cold, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. We huddled together in the shadows, trying to catch our breath, but every breath seemed heavier than the last. "Do you think we're safe here?" Jason whispered, his voice shaky. I didn't answer him immediately. The truth was, I didn't know. The car had moved on its own. We had seen the figure in the distance. The entire place felt cursed, infected by some malevolent force. How could we be safe anywhere? "The ground's shaking too much," Derek said, his voice rising in panic. "What if the cave collapses?" "We can't leave," I said. My voice was rough, barely audible over the cries that echoed in my head, like they were coming from inside the cave itself. "We're not safe out there. We're only safe here for now." "Safe?" Laura's voice was a hoarse whisper. "We're not safe anywhere. Those women, they want us. I can feel it." I nodded grimly, not trusting myself to speak. She was right. Every instinct screamed that we were in the presence of something beyond our understanding, something ancient and furious. A low rumble shook the earth again. The cries, those agonizing wails, seemed to grow louder. More voices joined the chorus, voices that were increasingly frantic. It wasn't just the cries of the dead anymore, it felt like the land itself was mourning, crying out for release. I could feel my own heart pounding in rhythm with their wails. I couldn't shake the image of the figure I had seen, tall, pale, and shrouded in shadow. Her hair had moved like it was caught in the wind, but there had been no wind. She had been a presence, something ancient and furious, and her eyes, those eyes had glowed with a malevolent light, as though she could see right through me, see into my very soul. Suddenly, a movement in the darkness near the back of the cave caught my attention. I froze. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it or if something was moving in the shadows. "Did you see that?" I whispered urgently. Jason's head jerked around, his eyes wide with fear. What is it?" "I don't know," I said, but the fear in my voice betrayed me. The others were silent now, listening, straining to hear. But the only sound that filled the cave was the distant wailing and the occasional rumble of the earth. Yet, something felt wrong. The air grew colder. I could feel it in my skin, in the hairs standing on the back of my neck. Then I saw it. A shadow moved just beyond the reach of the cave's dim light, like a figure shifting through the darkness. My heart stopped. "It's here," I gasped. Without warning, the cries grew deafening, the noise swelling into a cacophony of anguish and rage. My pulse raced as I scanned the shadows. The figure was moving closer, its shape becoming more defined. I tried to take a step back, but my foot hit something. I turned and saw the others, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror, but they too were frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense that something was coming for us. The figure emerged fully from the darkness. She wasn't alone. The cave seemed to stretch on forever, but what I saw emerging from the shadows was no longer human. The woman who had been in the distance was now closer, her face gaunt and twisted, her eyes wild with anger, her mouth opening to release a piercing, unnatural wail that seemed to shatter the very air around us. Her body was twisted, contorted in impossible angles, her limbs unnaturally long. And she was not alone. Behind her were others, more women, their faces pale and twisted by rage, their eyes filled with the same unnatural light, their forms shifting as though they were made of shadow itself. "What the hell is this?" Derek whispered in horror, his voice barely audible. There They're the ones who died, Laura murmured, her voice trembling. The ones who were wronged. And it hit me, these weren't just the spirits of the dead. These were banshees, creatures of grief and vengeance, seeking retribution for the pain they had endured in life. The ones who had died in this forsaken town had not found peace. Instead, they had been consumed by their rage, twisted into something darker, something that would never rest until they had their revenge. I stumbled backward, panic swelling in my chest. We need to get out of here, I shouted, my voice breaking. We need to. But I was cut off by the banshee's wail, louder than anything I had ever heard, the sound vibrating in my skull, in my bones. I tried to cover my ears, but it was no use. It was like the sound was inside my head, ripping apart my thoughts, tearing at my sanity. The ground trembled beneath us again, harder this time. Cracks appeared in the walls of the cave, and rocks began to fall from the ceiling. I could hear the shifting of earth, the grinding of stone as the banshees closed in on us. The walls of the cave were coming apart, but we were trapped. I grabbed Laura's hand, yanking her toward the back of the cave, where there was a narrow opening that might lead out. But as I turned, I caught a glimpse of the banshees' glowing eyes. They were moving toward us, faster than I could process, their long, twisted forms flowing like shadows in the dark. They were upon us. I saw Jason's face twist in terror as one of the banshees reached out for him, her fingers long and claw-like, her eyes gleaming with rage. His scream echoed in the cave, but it was swallowed up by the wail that filled the air. And then everything went black. Zombies in Louisiana. The air felt different that morning. There was something in the atmosphere, something thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't the usual oppressive heat of the Louisiana summer, but something more unsettling. I noticed it as I stepped out of my car, the humidity clinging to my skin like a second layer. I work for the local health department in Baton Rouge, managing routine investigations, but this morning, things felt off. It started with a phone call, something innocuous at first. A report from a rural town in the southern part of the state. A sudden spike in hospital admissions. People showing strange symptoms, fever, aggression, and violent outbursts. At first, it sounded like a typical outbreak, maybe the flu or some new strain of infection. But the tone and the voice of the caller, an old colleague who had been working in the area for years, was different. Desperation, fear. I don't know what's going on, Doc, she said, her voice cracking, but these people, they aren't just sick. They're changing. I thought she was exaggerating. Maybe she was tired, overwhelmed by the stress of working in a small town with limited resources. But something in her voice made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way she paused after each sentence, as if she were afraid of what she might say next. I agreed to come out and take a look. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. But when I arrived in that small town just past the marshes, I knew right away something was terribly wrong. The first thing I noticed when I got off the highway was the silence. The town, which was usually full of the sounds of life, the hum of trucks on the main road, the chatter of people in front of their houses, was eerily quiet. A place that should have been bustling with activity felt like a ghost town. No children playing in the streets, no one working in the fields. It was as though the entire population had suddenly vanished. I pulled up to the local clinic, where I was greeted by a doctor who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly as he shook mine. "Doc, you have to see this," he said. "You won't believe it." I followed him inside, the door creaking on its hinges as we stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The scent of antiseptic hung thick in the air, mingling with something faintly metallic, something that smelled too much like blood. Inside one of the rooms, I saw the first of them. A man, middle-aged, his skin pale, almost gray. He was lying on a gurney, his body trembling, his eyes wide open but glazed, staring into nothing. His chest heaved with shallow breaths. At first, I thought he was unconscious, but then he blinked and then he growled. I froze. It wasn't a normal sound. It was more like a guttural, animalistic growl, the kind you might hear from a wild creature. I stepped back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This is the third one, the doctor said. We've had 5 cases today, all showing the same symptoms. The others, they attacked. My mind raced. What could cause this? Was this some kind of new virus, some form of rabies or a mutation? I knew I had to stay calm, think through this logically. But it was hard to concentrate when the air in the room grew heavier with each passing second, thick with the tension of something dangerous lurking in the shadows. Suddenly, the man on the gurney jerked upright, his limbs stiff and unnatural, his mouth open as if he was about to scream. But the sound that came from him was nothing like a human scream. It was a low, rasping hiss. He lunged forward, and before anyone could react, he was on top of the doctor. I watched in horror as the man, whatever he had become, tore into the doctor's arm with shocking speed, his teeth sinking deep into flesh. Blood splattered, and the air was filled with the sound of desperate gasps and the horrible crunching of bone. The doctor screamed in agony, but the creature didn't stop. His eyes remained blank, unfocused, but his grip was relentless. I grabbed the nearest object, a metal tray, and swung it at the creature. It was like hitting a wall. He didn't even flinch. The tray barely made contact with his head before he swiped it away, his movements swift and violent. I barely dodged the blow before I turned and ran. The sound of footsteps behind me, the slapping of shoes against tile, pushed me to move faster. I burst through the door of the clinic and out into the parking lot. I didn't know where I was running, but all I could think of was getting away from that thing, from whatever was happening to these people. As I ran, I saw more of them, shambling figures, their eyes wide and unseeing, their mouths twisted in a permanent grimace. They didn't seem to care who they attacked. They weren't human anymore. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand how it was spreading so quickly. Was it a virus? Was it something else? All I knew was that this wasn't just some local outbreak. This was something bigger, something terrifying. I reached my car and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped them. I could hear the growls growing louder behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. It wasn't until I managed to start the car and peel out of the lot that I realized how much I had already underestimated what was happening in that town. It was only the beginning. I could feel it, the sense of something dark and uncontrollable. And it was spreading. I didn't stop driving until I was far from that small town. The feeling of safety was a distant memory, a fragile illusion that shattered as soon as I crossed the city limits. The road ahead seemed endless, but it felt like I was trapped in a tunnel, no way out, only the growing dread behind me. The whole drive back, my mind raced. What had I witnessed? Was it some kind of mass hysteria, or was something much worse unfolding in the shadows? I couldn't ignore the chilling growls, the way those creatures, those people, had moved. They weren't sick in the way we understood illness. This was something else entirely. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe there was an explanation, something logical, something I could grasp. The human mind craves understanding, especially when confronted with the terrifying unknown. But everything I thought about seemed to lead to more questions. I tried to call my supervisor at the health department, but the line was dead. It wasn't unusual for service to cut out in some rural areas, but something about the silence on the other end felt wrong. It wasn't just static, it was the absence of connection. It was as if the world itself was shutting down. By the time I reached Baton Rouge, it was clear that something was amiss. There were no sirens, no usual bustle of activity, just an eerie quiet that hung over the city like a heavy fog. I parked my car and walked to the entrance of the building. The doors were locked. It didn't take long for my mind to make the connection. The town I just left was isolated, but Baton Rouge? This place had hundreds of thousands of people, a heartbeat of activity. If this thing, whatever it was, had reached here, it would be devastating. And it was moving fast. I decided to go to the police station. Maybe there, I could find some answers, or at least a plan of action. When I arrived, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A few officers were standing outside the station, but they weren't engaging with anyone. They were staring at something down the street. I followed their gaze. A group of people, no, creatures, was walking down the middle of the road. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they had forgotten how to walk. They didn't look like the average pedestrian. Their bodies were stiff, their faces drawn into grimaces of pain or rage. They seemed to be searching, sniffing the air, their eyes scanning for something to tear into. Their clothes were torn, stained with something dark, something that looked too much like blood. One of the officers raised his gun, but he hesitated. It wasn't a normal hesitation. It was like he wasn't sure if he should be shooting at them or if they were even human anymore. He looked over at the other officers for reassurance. But they only stared back at him, their faces pale, uncertain. The creatures moved closer, their low growls filling the air. One of them stumbled toward the officers, its arms outstretched, eyes unfocused. It was almost as if it was calling to them, beckoning them to come closer. Without warning, the officer fired. The shot echoed down the street, a sharp crack that shattered the stillness. The creature dropped to the ground with a sickening thud. But it didn't stop. It twitched, its limbs jerking, and it started to rise again. The officer fired another shot, this time aiming for the head. But it was too late. The creature lunged, and everything descended into chaos. I didn't wait to see the aftermath. I turned and ran. I needed to get out, to find a safe place, to figure out what to do next. But the streets were filled with people I didn't recognize, shuffling, stumbling, some of them lurching forward as if they were being pulled by some unseen force. Their eyes locked on me, hungry. I found a nearby convenience store, the door unlocked. Inside, it was dark, and the air smelled stale. I crouched behind a shelf, trying to steady my breathing, my heart pounding. There had to be some kind of explanation for this, something that made sense. Maybe it was a new disease. Something that affected the brain, made people lose control, become violent. But the longer I sat there, listening to the distant sounds of screams and growls, the more I realized this wasn't something that could be explained. This wasn't some random outbreak. This was something planned, something orchestrated. I couldn't shake the feeling that this had been coming for a long time, something that had been brewing under the surface, hidden in plain sight. The sounds outside were getting closer, and I knew I had to leave before they found me. But where would I go? where was safe in a world that seemed to be falling apart. As I slipped out the back door of the store, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a group of people standing in the street, watching me. They were like the others, their faces expressionless, their eyes vacant, but somehow they knew I was there. It was as if they were drawn to me, sensing my fear, feeling the tremors in the air. I moved quickly, blending into the shadows as best as I could. My mind raced. What was happening? How far had this spread? And was I too late to stop it? The city was no longer a city. Baton Rouge was becoming a wasteland, its heartbeat fading, its soul slipping into something else, something that was no longer human. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, the crushing realization that I was part of something bigger now. There was no going back. No place of safety left. Not here. Not anywhere. I ran through the alleyways, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence, my breath quick and shallow. The streets had become a labyrinth of fear, and every corner turned was a reminder that the world I knew was gone. Those creatures, those people, were everywhere. I could hear their growls, the shuffle of feet dragging on cracked pavement, the occasional scream of someone unlucky enough to cross their path. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but it was only a text message. I pulled it out with trembling hands and looked at the screen. We're still here. Can't talk long. They're everywhere. It was from my colleague at the health department, Elena. She had been a rock for me during my time working in public health, always calm under pressure. But now, even her words seemed desperate, filled with the same panic I felt. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what. How could they? I quickly typed back. Where are you? What's happening? The response came quickly. We're in the building. People are turning. Can't leave. We're locked in. It's bad. I stared at the screen, the words sinking in. The disease had spread so quickly, and now the health department, the one place I thought could hold some answers, was overrun. And still, no one knew how this had started. No one knew how to stop it. I looked around, my mind racing. I needed a plan. I needed information. I needed a way out of this nightmare. But as I turned to leave the alley, something caught my eye. There, at the mouth of the street, was a figure standing still, like a statue. At first, I thought it was just another survivor, another person hiding from the chaos. But as I stared, the figure's movements grew unnatural. It twitched, its head jerking from side to side in sharp, sudden motions. The skin of its face was pale, too pale, stretched tight over its skull. Its eyes were wide, glazed, but they weren't looking at me, they were looking at something else. Something far away. I froze. The figure hadn't noticed me, or at least it hadn't acknowledged me. But its presence alone was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I stepped back into the shadow of the building, praying that it hadn't heard me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay anywhere. This wasn't some temporary outbreak that could be contained. This was an infestation, a plague, and it was moving fast. Suddenly, the creature's head snapped toward me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and a chill ran through my veins. It didn't move at first, just stared, as if it was calculating something. I felt my heartbeat race as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, it lunged. I didn't think. I just ran. My legs burned as I pushed forward, my breath coming in gasps, my feet pounding against the uneven ground. I glanced back, and the creature was still following, its arms outstretched, its mouth opening wide in a grotesque howl. I darted into a nearby building, slamming the door behind me. It didn't stop. It couldn't stop. These things, whatever they were, didn't tire. They didn't feel fear. They only hunted. The building was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. I couldn't afford to waste time. The door creaked, and I heard the sound of nails scraping against the wood as the creature reached for the handle. It was fast. Too fast. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have anything except the raw instinct to survive. I scrambled to the side, my eyes searching for something, anything I could use. There were pipes along the wall, rusty and old. I grabbed one, the metal cold in my hand, and I tightened my grip as I waited, heart hammering in my chest. The door shook again, this time harder, as if the creature was testing its strength. My fingers wrapped around the pipe, ready to strike. The door creaked louder, the creature's growls becoming more frantic. I was out of time. The door burst open, and in that moment, I swung the pipe with every ounce of strength I had left. The impact was solid. There was a sickening crunch, followed by a brief silence. For a moment, I thought I'd killed it. But then the creature staggered back, the blood from its head pooling onto the floor, its body twitching in an unnatural rhythm. It was still alive. Still coming. I ran again, hearing its footsteps behind me. I didn't dare look back this time. I just kept running, hoping that somehow, somewhere, there would be an answer. The world outside was gone. Whatever hope I had of finding answers or a way out was fading. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know who was still alive. And with every turn, I felt myself slipping further and further into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The sounds of my frantic footsteps echoed in the hallway as I bolted through the dark building, the dim light flickering above me. My heart raced, blood pumping in my ears as the adrenaline surged. I couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening around me. I was in survival mode. I had to keep moving. The metal pipe felt heavy in my hands, but it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I clutched it like a lifeline, my knuckles white, my body trembling from the strain. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I couldn't stay here. The building was silent for a moment. Too silent. But then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like claws against concrete. The creature from before. It was still following me. I stumbled into a small room and slammed the door behind me, my breath coming in short bursts. The room was empty, save for some old, broken furniture. A single window offered a glimpse of the outside, but it only made the situation worse. The world beyond that window was chaos. I could see the smoke rising from various buildings in the distance. Fires. Explosions. People running for their lives. The world was unraveling, and I was trapped in the middle of it. I pressed my back against the door, listening. The creature was closer now. I could hear it scratching, dragging its body across the floor. It was relentless. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. I was running out of options, and I was running out of time. A voice broke through the static in my mind, Elena. Her words were a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the midst of the storm. She was still out there. Somewhere. The health department building was still standing, still holding out, but I had no idea for how long. My phone buzzed again, and I jumped, nearly dropping it. I pulled it out, hands shaking, and quickly read the new message. "They're breaking in. We're not safe. Get here now." I read the words over and over, each one sinking into me like a stone. I had to get to her. I had to get to the health department. If there was any chance of stopping this madness, that was where it would be. But as I looked back at the door, I knew it wasn't that simple. The creature was on the other side now, its growls louder, its claws scraping against the wood. I could feel it, feel its hunger, feel the dark energy that pulsed with every move it made. I had to make a choice. Stay here, wait, and hope for a miracle, or face what was waiting outside and try to get to Elena. My legs were already aching, my body screaming for rest, but there was no time for that. No time for fear. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. The growls had stopped. The silence was unnerving, even more so than the growls had been. It was like the creature was toying with me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had no doubt that it would strike. I had to move. With a deep breath, I turned and ran for the window. There was no other way out of the room. I climbed onto a nearby chair, trying to steady myself as I pried open the window. It stuck, but with a grunt, I finally got it open enough to slip through. I didn't have time to think about what was outside. I didn't have time to wonder if it was safer. I just needed to go. The air was thick with smoke, the sounds of distant screams and explosions filling the air. I climbed out onto the fire escape, my feet barely finding purchase on the narrow steps. The building was taller than I had realized, but I didn't care. I kept moving, climbing down, not stopping until I reached the ground. The street was chaos. Cars abandoned in the middle of the road. Fires burning. People running, screaming. And in the distance, I could hear the unmistakable sound of the creatures, the monsters, the zombies, whatever they were, howling as they hunted. I sprinted through the streets, my heart pounding in my chest. Every corner I turned, I half expected to run into another of those things. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. For Elena. For the people who might still have a chance. I reached the health department building faster than I expected, the imposing structure looming ahead of me like a fortress. But as I drew closer, something didn't feel right. The building's windows were shattered. The doors, once sturdy and secure, hung open. The air inside was thick with dust and smoke, and I could hear distant shuffling noises. I entered cautiously, the door creaking behind me as I stepped inside. The hallway was dark, the overhead lights flickering erratically. I could hear voices, low whispers, muffled and panicked. It was clear that something had gone horribly wrong. The building was no longer safe. It was another place I would have to fight through. "Elena?" I called softly, trying not to sound too desperate. No answer. Just the distant scratching, the dragging of feet. My grip tightened around the pipe in my hands as I crept forward, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. And then I saw her. Elena stood at the end of the hall, her back to me. She was holding something in her hands, something wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped closer. "Elena?" I whispered again, but this time her head turned slowly, mechanically. Her eyes were wide, glazed over. And then I saw it. Her skin was pale, her face gaunt. Her body was shaking, twitching, like the creatures I'd seen. She wasn't Elena anymore. Not fully. She was one of them. I froze. The moment felt like an eternity. And then, she lunged. The world seemed to slow as Elena's twisted form lunged toward me. Her mouth opened wide, revealing teeth that were no longer human, sharp and jagged. The growl that escaped her lips was guttural, a sound that no longer held any trace of the woman I once knew. My heart pounded, my body paralyzed by disbelief. I stumbled backward, raising the pipe instinctively, but there was no time to think. Elena, or whatever she had become, was too fast. Her hand shot out, claws scraping across my arm, and pain exploded in my side. I gasped, my breath ragged, but I couldn't stop. I had no choice but to fight. The pipe crashed against her arm with a sickening crack. She recoiled, but only for a moment. Her eyes, empty and dead, focused on me again. It wasn't Elena anymore. It was a monster, a ravenous, mindless beast. The woman I loved was gone. Tears blurred my vision, but I wiped them away, trying to focus. I swung the pipe again, this time aiming for her head. But she was relentless, faster than I could react. With a snarl, she swiped at me, the claws raking across my chest, tearing through my shirt and skin. Blood poured from the wound, but I fought through the pain, refusing to let her take me down. My thoughts were clouded by fear and rage. I had to survive. For her memory. For everyone who was still out there, clinging to whatever hope they had left. But I could feel myself weakening. The fight was draining me. The room seemed to grow colder, darker, the air thick with the stench of death. I couldn't stop. I couldn't give in. In one desperate, final swing, I drove the pipe into her skull. The sickening sound of cracking bone echoed in the hall. For a moment, she froze, her body twitching as if caught in some kind of spasm. Then, she collapsed to the ground, motionless. I stood there, panting, my chest heaving with the exertion. Blood dripped from my arm, my side, my chest. I had done it. But at what cost? The silence that followed was deafening, the world around me now nothing more than a hollow echo. I stumbled backward, looking at Elena's lifeless body. The woman who had once been my everything. The woman who had believed in me. She was gone, consumed by whatever this disease was. A soft noise broke my reverie, footsteps. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, clutching the pipe tighter, my body tense. There, in the shadows of the hallway, I saw a figure moving toward me. Elena? I whispered, hoping against hope, even though I knew it wasn't possible. But as the figure stepped into the dim light, I saw the truth. It wasn't her. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was just another monster. I stumbled back, but my legs were weak. There were more of them. More than I could fight. The pipe felt heavier in my hands as I realized that my chance for survival was slipping away. The creature advanced slowly, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I could hear its breath, slow, shallow, as if savoring the moment before the final strike. My chest tightened, the air growing thin. My body screamed for rest, for escape, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, the sound of shuffling feet filled the room. It wasn't just one creature. It was dozens. The hallway was filling with them. They were coming from every direction. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, trying to think, but the panic was rising again. It was too much. There was no way out. There was no way to win. But then, in that moment of despair, a voice echoed through the hallway. Over here. I turned my head sharply. It was a familiar voice, strong, determined. It was the voice of someone who had survived. I knew that voice. It was Rick. I didn't hesitate. My legs moved before my mind could even catch up. I ran toward the voice, desperate for the smallest sliver of hope. Rick had always been there for me. He had never let me down. I rounded a corner and saw him standing there, holding a gun. His eyes were wide with panic, but there was something else in him, resolve. He motioned for me to hurry, and without thinking, I ran toward him, stumbling but unwilling to stop. "Get down!" Rick shouted as I neared. I hit the ground just as he fired. The sound of the shot rang out, sharp and deafening, and I felt a surge of hope as the creature in front of me dropped to the floor, lifeless. "We don't have much time," Rick said, pulling me to my feet. His grip was firm, but his face was pale. He was just as scared as I was, but he wasn't showing it. "There's a way out. We need to move." I nodded, breathless, as he pulled me along. The sound of more creatures echoed down the hall, but Rick didn't falter. We moved quickly, our feet echoing in the silence of the building. Every step felt like a victory, but I knew it wouldn't last. The creatures were everywhere. We reached the back door, and Rick threw it open. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, cold and sharp. But it was freedom. For a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. But that feeling was short-lived. The creatures were already there, waiting. They had surrounded the building, cutting off our escape. We were trapped again. Rick's eyes scanned the area, looking for a way out. There was none. Just more of them. And then, just like that, the world went black. City without souls. It was supposed to be a routine shift. Another night, another round in the labyrinth of tunnels beneath New York City. The workers had gotten used to the murk, the constant hum of the underground, the smell of damp stone and metal. I had been down there for weeks, part of the team tasked with repairing the aging infrastructure. But something wasn't right. I felt it the moment I stepped into the tunnel, as if the air was thicker, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. At first, it was the silence. Or rather, the absence of the usual sounds. Normally, there were the creaks and groans of the old pipes, the distant rumble of trains above ground, even the occasional scurry of small animals. But tonight, there was nothing. The world had muted itself, leaving only the echo of my footsteps. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. It was probably nothing. A long shift, the stress of working so far below the earth, maybe even too many cups of stale coffee. I adjusted my helmet, flicked on my flashlight, and moved deeper into the tunnel. The others were already scattered across the work site, their voices low and muffled in the distance. I walked past them, noting the way they moved with a sense of urgency, glancing over their shoulders, as if aware of something that wasn't quite right. But nobody said anything, not at first. Then came the sound. A faint rustling, like paper scraping against stone. My head snapped around, searching the darkness. The light from my flashlight flickered for a second, casting shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. I took a breath, but my lungs felt too tight. It was only the wind, I told myself. Only the wind. But as I stood there, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, the sound came again, closer this time. A low, scrabbling noise, like claws against concrete. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively gripped the flashlight tighter. The shadows shifted again, this time more pronounced, like something large and fast moving just out of sight. I wasn't alone down here. I took a step forward, trying to push the feeling of dread from my mind. Maybe a rat or some other small creature had gotten into the tunnels, a common enough occurrence in this part of the city. But rats didn't make that kind of noise. They didn't scrape and gnaw on the walls like something with claws. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I turned toward the others. They hadn't heard it. Or if they had, they weren't acknowledging it. Their heads were down, their bodies tense as they worked, oblivious to the strange noise that was now growing louder, more insistent. I took another step, my boots echoing through the tunnel. The noise stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own breathing, the hum of the machinery behind me. I turned my head quickly, trying to catch any movement in the darkness. Nothing. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was imagining things. But that feeling, heavy, suffocating, still clung to me. I turned back to the crew, shaking my head. Nothing to worry about. Just get the job done. But as I moved, something else caught my eye. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But no. This was different. The figure moved along the wall, dark against the stone. It was too large to be a rat. Too smooth, too deliberate. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. It was getting closer. I took a step back, the noise starting again, this time unmistakable, the sound of something scraping across the floor. And then, something worse, a low, guttural growl, deep in the shadows. I blinked, hoping it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But the growl came again, louder this time, and then, finally, the thing stepped into the light. It was massive. Too big to be anything I had ever seen. It moved with an unnatural grace, its beady eyes gleaming in the light of my flashlight. Its fur was matted and patchy, and its teeth, too long, too sharp, glinted in the dark. A rat? No, this was something else. Something wrong. I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I tried to keep it trained on the creature. It didn't stop. It kept coming. And then, a dozen more appeared from the shadows. Each one was bigger than the last, their eyes glowing, their bodies rippling with strange, inhuman power. They were everywhere, crawling out of the walls, swarming toward us. Panic surged through me. The others were still oblivious, still working, unaware of the nightmare closing in on them. I opened my mouth to shout, but the growl from the pack was louder now, drowning out my voice. The creatures were circling, getting closer. My heart raced, my hands shook as I backed into the corner of the tunnel, my flashlight flickering. I had to escape. I had to warn them. But the creatures were already there. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, as if the very air in the tunnel was being suffocated by the presence of those things. The creatures moved slowly, like they were savoring the terror in the air. Their eyes never left me, gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. It wasn't the instinctual hunger of animals, it was something worse. I backed into the cold stone wall, my mind racing. I should scream, I should run, but every instinct in my body screamed that movement would only make it worse. The rats, they were more than rats, were so close now, their scratching claws leaving marks on the walls as they crept forward with a chilling patience. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, deafening, thumping in rhythm with the growls that echoed around me. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and the words got stuck. My flashlight flickered one last time, casting a dim light on the first row of creatures in front of me. They were bigger than any rat I had ever seen. Their fur was matted, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways, their spines slightly curved as if they'd been deformed by some hidden malady. They moved with a grotesque precision, every step calculated, as if they had been watching me for far longer than I had noticed them. I turned my head quickly, trying to find a way out, but the tunnel stretched endlessly in front of me. The others were too far away, deep in their own work. I had to warn them. But how? How could anyone believe me? The creature closest to me let out a hiss, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth, too many teeth for something that should be a rodent. It was something out of a nightmare. Something wrong. I couldn't hold my ground much longer. My breath came in shallow gasps. I glanced around desperately, looking for anything that could help. The tunnel was bare. A few scattered tools, the remnants of old wiring, and the rusted metal piping that snaked along the walls. Nothing that could defend against these monstrous rats. The next thing I saw froze my blood. One of the creatures, larger than the rest, emerged from the shadows. It was the leader, I could tell. It was different from the others. Its eyes were not just hungry, they were calculating. It moved closer, its breath heavy in the silence of the tunnel. Its claws scraped against the concrete floor, sending a shiver through me. I tried to move. I tried to push myself away from the wall, but my legs were paralyzed with fear. It was as though my body was betraying me. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight. All I could do was stare into the abyss of the creature's eyes, the dark pools of malice that seemed to swallow everything around me. A loud crash suddenly broke the tension, echoing through the tunnel. It wasn't from the creatures. It was from above, somewhere above ground. The sound of metal tearing and wood splintering. The tunnel trembled beneath my feet. My first instinct was to look up, to try and find the source of the noise, but the movement only confirmed what I had feared. The ceiling above me cracked. The ground shook. The floor beneath my feet felt as though it was going to collapse, sending me plummeting into the depths of the tunnel, swallowed whole by the darkness. The creatures, however, didn't flinch. They didn't pause. They were aware of the chaos, but it didn't seem to matter to them. The leader of the pack finally moved in. It was too close now. I could smell the rank stench of its fur, the fetid odor that seemed to seep into the air around me. I felt my pulse quicken, a rising panic clawing at the back of my throat. Then it struck. One of the smaller creatures lunged toward me, its claws outstretched. The others followed in quick succession, all of them converging in a blur of fur and teeth. My mind screamed for escape, but my body was too slow. I raised my arms instinctively to protect myself, but it was useless. One of the creatures sank its teeth into my wrist, its bite sharp and searing. I yelled out, my voice echoing against the walls, but the sound of my own scream was drowned out by the chattering and growling of the rats around me. The world blurred as the pain shot through me. I felt myself being dragged to the ground, my body giving into the weight of the creatures pressing in from every side. There was no way out. The leader watched me with those soulless eyes, its mouth dripping with saliva. Then, with a sudden twist, it turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving me with the others. It was as if I was no longer worth its time. I lay on the cold floor, gasping for breath. My wrists burned where the creature had bitten me. I could hear the skittering of claws on concrete, the faint rustle of fur brushing against my skin. but I couldn't move. I didn't know if I could. The noise started to fade, and the tunnel grew quieter. I barely registered that the creatures were leaving me, retreating into the shadows. But the fear didn't go away. I still felt their eyes on me, the weight of their presence heavy in the silence. They were watching, waiting. I knew then that I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone anymore. The shadows were closing in, the walls of the tunnel pressing in from every side. Something had changed down here. Something had awakened. And no matter how far I ran, how fast I moved, it was never going to let me go. I had to survive. But I wasn't sure if survival was the same as escaping. I stumbled to my feet, still shaking, still trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me. The other workers still hadn't noticed. They still hadn't heard the shrieks, the sounds of claws scraping against concrete, or the growls from the dark. They would soon. I could still feel the sting on my wrist, the gnawing burn where those creatures had sunk their teeth. The bleeding had slowed, but the pain remained, sharp and throbbing. I wiped my hand against the cold, gritty stone of the tunnel wall, trying to steady myself. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step I took echoed unerringly through the dark, empty space. There was no escape, not from the creatures, and not from the terror clawing at my mind. I forced myself to move, slowly at first. Every creak of the tunnel seemed to amplify in the thick silence, every scuffle of my boots on the floor too loud, too out of place. I could feel them watching me. I knew they were still out there, hiding just beyond the edge of my flashlight's flickering beam. But I couldn't look back. I couldn't risk it. If I did, I might see something that would push me over the edge, and that was the last thing I needed right now. Focus, I muttered to myself. You just need to get out. You just need to get to the others. But as the minutes passed, I began to doubt if they were even still alive. Had the creatures already found them? Were they next? My thoughts spun in a dark whirlpool, and I could feel my sanity slipping. The walls of the tunnel, once so familiar, seemed to close in tighter with each passing moment, as if the very stone were conspiring against me. Then, a noise broke through the silence. A scraping sound, soft but unmistakable. I froze, my body tense, every muscle strung tight. The sound came again, closer this time. Something was moving in the darkness. I wasn't alone. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, hard in my throat, only to catch a glimpse of something large scuttling quickly across the ground. It was gone before I could fully process what I'd seen, but the flash of its shadow lingered in my mind, an image seared into my thoughts. My stomach lurched, and I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the panic that was bubbling up inside me. It was still there, waiting. The creatures were everywhere now, I realized. They weren't just in front of me, they were all around me. Silent, patient, hungry. I quickened my pace, stumbling forward with each step. I had no idea where I was going anymore. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls were no longer just stone, they were alive, pulsating with a strange energy, as if they, too, were part of the creature's network. A part of whatever malevolent force had taken root here. And then, a horrible thought occurred to me. What if the tunnels were their domain? What if they controlled everything down here? What if the workers, the tunnels, the entire city above, were just pawns in their game? The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. The sound of more scraping claws reached my ears again, closer this time. They were closing in. I glanced around frantically, searching for an exit, a ladder, anything that could offer me even the smallest chance of escape. But there was nothing. The tunnel stretched on, and every turn led only to more darkness, more shadows. I was trapped. The temperature seemed to drop, and I shivered as a cold breeze swept through the tunnel. It wasn't natural. It felt wrong, like the wind itself was breathing in sync with the creatures. I turned a corner, hoping to find something, anything, but all I saw was another long stretch of tunnel, identical to the last. And then, as if my mind had conjured it, a figure appeared before me. At first, I thought it was one of the workers, someone I knew, someone who had come to help. But the closer I looked, the more my stomach twisted. The figure was slumped, its body hunched and distorted. Its face. It was contorted in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Its eyes, no, they weren't eyes at all, but deep, hollow pits. A rat. Or something that had once been human. It moved toward me with a jerking, unnatural gait, its limbs twitching in spasms. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to call out, to scream, but no sound came. The figure was getting closer, its eyes locked on mine with a single-minded focus, and all I could do was stand there frozen, my legs unwilling to obey. "Run," a voice screamed in my mind. But I couldn't. The creature stopped just a few feet away. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth, stained with blood. A low, rattling growl escaped its throat, and then it lunged. Instinct kicked in, and I dodged to the side just in time, feeling the rush of air as its claws missed me by inches. My body moved before my brain could catch up, and I ran blindly down the tunnel, not caring where I was going. I could hear it behind me, its claws scraping the ground as it chased me. The sound was deafening. It was gaining on me. I could feel its breath on my neck, cold and fetid. I glanced behind me, but I couldn't see anything. The darkness had swallowed it whole. Had it given up? Or was it just waiting for the right moment to strike? And that's when I heard it, the unmistakable chattering, the skittering sound of dozens, maybe hundreds, of creatures rushing through the tunnel. They were closing in from all sides. I had to get out. I had to survive. But in that moment, I realized with a sickening clarity, this wasn't just a fight for my life. This was a fight for my soul. The creatures were after more than just flesh. They were after something deeper. Something far more dangerous. The air in the tunnel grew colder, thick with the rancid stench of decay. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a frantic drum, matching the rhythm of my panicked footsteps. I could hear them, so many of them, scraping and chittering in the darkness, their claws tapping against the stone in a maddening, rhythmic symphony. My mind spun with terror, unable to focus, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of what was happening. I stumbled over a loose stone, catching myself just before I fell. My flashlight flickered in my shaking hands, its beam catching only brief glimpses of the surrounding walls. Shadows danced on the edges of my vision, twisted and grotesque, as if the tunnel itself had come alive to swallow me whole. There was no end to the tunnel. No escape. I sprinted, heart hammering, praying for a miracle, praying for the light of day, for the comforting sounds of civilization. But the deeper I went, the more oppressive the darkness became. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a living thing, a suffocating force that seemed to press against my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I couldn't hear the creatures anymore, but I knew they were close. They were everywhere, waiting. Suddenly, My foot slipped on the wet floor, and I plunged forward, landing hard on the cold stone. The flashlight flew from my hand, rolling away into the blackness. Panic surged in me, but I couldn't afford to stop. I scrambled to my feet, hands slick with sweat and dirt. My fingers brushed against the stone walls, desperate for any sign of direction, of salvation. But there was nothing. The sound of claws scraping against the stone broke through the silence again, much closer this time. My pulse quickened, and I twisted in the direction of the noise, but I couldn't see them. I couldn't see anything. The flashlight had gone out. I reached for my pocket, my fingers trembling as I fumbled for my phone, but it was useless. No signal. The tunnels swallowed everything. The light, the sound, the time, it was all swallowed by the shadows. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A flicker of movement. A shadow in the darkness, moving too quickly, too fluidly to be human. I froze, fear locking me in place. The shape grew larger, and I realized, with growing horror, that it wasn't just one. It was a mass, a swarm of creatures, more than I could ever count, all skittering toward me. Their eyes gleamed in the dark, red and glowing, like the fires of hell itself. Their bodies shifted and pulsed in unnatural ways, their grotesque limbs moving in perfect synchronization. I was surrounded. There was no escape. No way out. I was a prey animal in a hunter's den. I turned and ran again, not knowing where to go, only driven by the primal need to survive. My breath was ragged, my legs weak beneath me. I could hear the creatures closing in, their sharp claws tapping on the stone, their growls and screeches ringing in the air. And then, nothing. The sound stopped. The air grew still. I dared to glance back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The tunnel behind me was empty, silent. Had I lost them? But as I exhaled, relief for the brief moment of quiet, a low, rumbling growl filled the air, so deep, so menacing, that it seemed to vibrate through my chest. My blood ran cold. They had stopped chasing me. They had already won. I turned to run again, but before I could take a single step, I felt a cold hand grip my ankle. It was icy, like the touch of death itself. My heart leapt in my chest as I was yanked violently off my feet, crashing to the ground with a bone-jarring impact. The pain was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the terror that gripped me as I saw what had caught me. A massive, twisted creature, its body a grotesque mass of fur and muscle, its eyes glowing bright red, was looming over me, its mouth stretching open impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It hissed, a sound like metal scraping against metal, and I could feel its rancid breath on my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My body was frozen in terror, unable to move. The creature's claws dug into the stone, scraping along the ground as it advanced. Its eyes fixed on mine, unblinking, as if it could see into the very core of my soul. And then, just as I thought it was about to strike, the creature stopped. It tilted its head, sniffing the air. I didn't understand what was happening. Why had it stopped? Then, in that moment of horrifying clarity, I realized the truth. The creatures weren't hunting me. They weren't interested in my flesh. They wanted my soul. I gasped, the realization sinking into me like a weight of lead. The creatures weren't just physical threats, they were parasites, feeding on something far more precious, something that couldn't be seen, something that lived inside of me. They had been drawn to my fear, my weakness. And now, they would claim me, body and soul. I had no more strength to fight. No more energy to run. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end to come. But as I prepared for the final, crushing blow, a distant sound reached my ears. A faint, familiar sound. It was a voice. "Hey, wake up. Come on, get up." It was a shout, urgent and close. Someone was there. I opened my eyes, blinking in confusion, and saw a figure, illuminated by the faint glow of a flashlight. A worker, a real worker, not one of the creatures, was standing over me, extending a hand. "Come on," the voice said, frantic. "We need to go, now." Without thinking, I grabbed the hand, pulling myself up. I didn't look back. I didn't care anymore. I followed the worker, running toward the faint light at the end of the tunnel, my only thought to escape, to survive. But as I ran, I could hear the creatures again, their growls rising in volume. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It would never be over. The city above had no idea what was happening beneath its streets. And by the time they did, it would already be too late. When I emerged from the tunnel, the daylight felt strange. Like it wasn't real. The world above was bright, but the shadows in my mind were darker than ever. The creatures had followed us. And there was no place safe. Not anymore. I stumbled out of the tunnel, my legs unsteady, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The worker who had helped me pull free was moving quickly, not saying a word. He just kept looking over his shoulder, his pace quickening as he heard the screeches from the depths. I tried to focus on the light, the harsh, blinding sunlight of the world above, but it felt wrong, alien, like I didn't belong here anymore. The sky was clear, the city's streets bustling with life. Everything was just as it should be, but I wasn't the same. "What's happening?" I gasped, my voice shaky, barely a whisper. I needed answers. I needed to know if I was the only one. If there was any hope left. The worker didn't answer immediately. His eyes were wide, darting around, scanning every shadow as if expecting the creatures to appear at any moment. He turned to face me, his expression pale, strained. "We can't stop them," he muttered, barely audible over the growing sounds of the city. "You should have left when you had the chance. We all should have. But now it's too late." "What do you mean?" I demanded, gripping his arm. "Too late for what?" He exhaled sharply, his face tight with fear. "You saw them, didn't you? The rats, or whatever they are. They're not just in the tunnels. They're everywhere. They can go anywhere. They've gotten into the sewers, into the walls of this city. They're spreading." A sickening realization twisted in my gut, something that had been hovering at the edges of my mind. "Are you telling me they're taking people?" He nodded grimly, looking away as if ashamed. "They've been doing it for years. No one noticed, not until now. They feed on fear, on people's souls. They're using the city as their nest. And we've been too blind to see it." I felt the ground beneath me sway as if the very earth were shifting. I wanted to scream, to ask how this could be possible, but I couldn't find the words. My mind was drowning in disbelief. But then, a noise broke through the chaos in my mind, faint at first, then louder, unmistakable. The scratching. It was coming from the shadows. I whipped around, my body tense with dread. There, at the edge of the street, a figure moved, a huge, misshapen shadow that slithered against the wall of a nearby building. It wasn't just one. They were multiplying. I saw others emerging from the shadows, crawling from between cracks in the pavement, their glowing red eyes piercing the darkness. The creatures had already reached the surface. In that moment, I understood. They weren't just looking for food. They were hunting. They had come for us all, and there would be no escape. I looked back at the worker, his face twisted with hopelessness. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice frantic. "There's nothing we can do," he replied, his voice empty. "We've been marked. The city's already gone. All we can do is try to survive until they get what they want." "No." I shook my head violently. "There has to be something. We can fight them, stop them." He gazed at me with sad eyes. "They don't want to kill us. Not yet. They want us to suffer first. Fear feeds them. And we're all their prey now. We've got nothing left." I refused to believe him. I wouldn't accept it. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from down the street. The sound of glass shattering and a scream that sent ice through my veins. People were running, scattering in panic, but there was no safe place to hide. The rats, no, these monsters, were everywhere. I could hear their screeches now, louder and more aggressive. They were closing in. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing the worker's arm and pulling him along. But he resisted, shaking his head, his body stiff with terror. "No," he whispered. "We can't outrun them. They'll find us." But I wouldn't stop. I couldn't. I pushed through the crowd, forcing my way forward, my heart racing with a single, desperate hope: survival. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to go somewhere, anywhere, away from the horror that was unfolding. We reached a narrow alleyway, its shadows deep and suffocating. I didn't think, only moved. But then, a figure appeared in the darkness. A man, standing motionless, staring at us. I didn't recognize him at first, but there was something about his presence that felt wrong, unnatural. The worker pulled back in fear, but I was too late. The man's eyes were glowing with the same sickening red light that I had seen in the creatures. His mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "No," the worker gasped, backing away. "It's already too late for him." The man lunged at us, and instinctively, I shoved the worker out of the way, throwing myself into the alley's deepening shadows. I turned and ran, hearing the man's laughter echo behind me, twisted and dark. The creatures weren't just in the tunnels. They were infiltrating every corner of the city, every street, every home. They were here to stay. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran until my legs gave out, until the weight of the world seemed to crush me. And in that moment, as I collapsed into the dark alley, my heart full of fear and my mind shattered, I realized the truth. There was no escape. The city was lost. We were all lost. And the creatures, they had already won. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.